Japanimation Station.
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff podcast. I am Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again to dive into the wild and wacky world of anime. This week on the show, we are wrapping up our look at the original movie series of Kokutou no Kyoukai, the adaptation of the novels, with movies 6 and 7. We, of course, will take a look at movie 8, which is made on new material next week. We're taking a look at movie 6, Oblivion Recording, and movie 7, A Study in Murder Part 2, which wraps up effectively the original novel series of Kokutou no Kyoukai.
Indeed, it is a very definitive ending. I was actually, because I was very curious going into this, not knowing what all the extra material would be, like the original 7, what would that ending feel like? Because there is several more hours of material out there. This is a very definitive ending. If there was absolutely nothing more, I would be, that was perfect. So, yeah.
Yes, technically there is one piece of the novels that has not been adapted, which is the epilogue, which we will talk about next time. But that, I believe, that was added on in like the second release of the novels anyways. But yes, this is very much, if they'd never made anything more, if this was just the ending, this is like the complete version of the story. And then everything else is like supplemental material that is nice to have. I like the other 3 things we will watch for the next episode, but this feels like this is the core of what the story is about.
I loved it, and I just have to say, like, particularly in reaction to movie 7, which is the longer thing we're watching, it's the longest of the individual parts, it's a full 2 hours, a couple minutes longer than Paradox Spiral, and in reaction to that, I just was kind of blown away by how moved I was by the end of it. Mm-hmm. Like, whatever I feel like this show had conditioned me to expect, soaring tear-jerking romance wasn't necessarily what I expected, and yet it feels so perfect. I think if I were to introduce Kokutou no Kyoukai, Garden of Sinners, to new people who hadn't heard of it before, and I wanted to give them the one-sentence pitch, what is this crazy anime thing, I would tell them, it's a love story. And then I would say, it's going to take a little while to feel like one, because it's really gory, and it's really fucked up, and there's a lot of fucked up shit along the way, but it's a love story. And it's a beautiful love story.
Yes, and now you know, we've been talking about in each episode this kind of like metaphor for the series, which is it's a puzzle and you're getting the pieces in different orders and you're trying to sort of match it all together. And then once you've put all the pieces together, you see the full puzzle and you can step back from it. And I think that's part of the effect. Because that's very much how I've been seeing all the movies, even though like I haven't talked about it necessarily in that way. Because it doesn't feel like that, I think, when you're in the midst of it as much. But when you're done with it and you're looking at it from a distance and you know that this is, ultimately, these movies are about Kokutou and Shiki's relationship. And it's about how these two people who are both kind of weird and kind of broken, but in extremely different ways, how they kind of find each other. They learn to overcome what is kind of inhibiting them from being able to be together. And they both kind of meet in the middle. It's kind of that structure, right? Like Kokutou changes a lot over the last movie. Shiki changes a lot over the last movie. But that you have seen all those elements get put into place over the course of the previous 6 films. It is very much the whole story is about their relationship and them being able to come together at the end of the movie as a couple. And, you know, it's not romantic, I think, in a traditional sense. But it is a romance about these two people learning how to live a life together.
Absolutely. And it's extraordinary. And I think having now seen the full puzzle in place, it just, I don't think parts 6 and 7 are my favorite two parts of the series. I don't think they're designed to be like the most impactful parts of the series, but I do think that having now watched them, everything else seems just that much richer and more profound and interesting, and, immediately makes me want to watch it all again. And something I hope we can talk about later on, Sean, is just your experience watching it a second time. I'm like more interested in than my own experience just seeing it the first time, because I know it must be like very revelatory in its own way.
Yeah, I think it is just like when you watch it with a built-in like knowledge of who the people, like who these two characters are and what their endpoint is. You do see all those little moments along the way, all those little like character moments all the way back to the first movie, and like that opening scene. It is like this kind of revelation of that. It's like, oh yeah, it is just a love story about these two people. And so people get their fucking hearts ripped out and destroyed in sometimes, or they get killed and replace themselves with puppets, or like destroy an entire bridge with their crazy psychic powers. Lots of other crazy shit happens. But at the end of the day, it is about these two people coming together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm excited to break it down and to go through these final films. Do you want to go ahead and jump in with part 6 here?
Yes. And so I think kind of how I set this up at the end of the last episode of the podcast when we talked about Paradox Spiral is I think part of the structure of the ending of the series, which is interesting, is that Paradox Spiral is like the big climax, right? It's like neither of these last two parts are at the scale of that movie. We're not like threatening reality or whatever the way that Soren is. It's nothing that's that huge, and particularly movie 6, Oblivion Record or Oblivion Recording, is like a palate cleanser is what this movie feels like to me, right? It's like this big come down from the height of movie 5 to kind of sweep the plate a little bit to get us ready for movie 7, which is very intimate and very much focused on our two leads. And movie 6 is where we get Azaka, Kokutou's little sister, who has been like in the background of all of these movies. She's in the books a little bit more than she's in the movies. As is like a lot of the stuff that's kind of on the edges. Obviously, the book has a lot more space to just sort of like flesh some of that stuff out. But she's been with us the whole time, but we've never really focused in on her. And so movie 6 gives us time to spend with her. It has a much different energy because of that. It's a lot more kind of energetic and a little bit more bright. It's much more comedic than any of the other movies, none of which are comedic. Some of them, there are some funny moments, and I think Shiki's like kind of dry sarcasm is often very funny in some of the other movies, but none of the other movies are like funny. I think Oblivion Record is often quite funny, and Shiki and Azaka's interactions are very funny. But I think the fun thing about Oblivion Record is that, okay, just put all the other shit aside, like have one more kind of adventure with your cast, another kind of case of the week, a little bit lighter energy, and kind of clear the palette. And I've always enjoyed Oblivion Record for that it is just, it feels like one last adventure with all your buddies is how this movie comes across to me.
Yeah, and I think it's, it is the least substantial of the 7, but it is designed to be the least substantial in some ways. Like, in terms of actual plot significance, the only thing that happens that has, like, a bearing on anything going forward is that Shiki's memories are restored by the enemy mage at the end of the film. And really, more than anything, that's just to sort of set up a base level of tension for the next movie where the murders start happening again, and the audience kind of in the back of their mind is going, is this because she got her memories back? Is she the killer? Is she not? Blah, 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 right? But what I think it does is in the like structure of the series is exactly what you were saying. Palate cleanser. It's fun. It's silly. It's a different kind of mode for the series, and it is fun to see that experimentation. I don't think it overstays its welcome. It's one of the hour-long ones. It's very solid in that sense. But more than anything, even though Kokutou, Mikia Kokutou, the main character, is not in this one that much, it's mostly his sister, and it's mostly Shiki. I think this one is like invaluable for getting a perspective on who he is and what he means to people. And I think there's this thread throughout the movie that starts with our first scene, which is this sort of like moving star field over a city, and this little hint of like Azaka and Mikia as kids. And this memory, the first line of the movie is, "I had a dream about my childhood." And we keep kind of coming back, and then in the end, we see that moment in full. We have Azaka remember it literally as her primal moment, is what she calls it. And I think it gives us an insight into who Kokutou is that I think watching movie 7 felt completely invaluable. Like, I think it like tells you a lot. Like, I think you could very easily cut movie 6 for plot reasons. But I think if you were watching movie 7 without it, I don't think a lot of Kokutou's material in that movie would be nearly as sort of interesting without that sense of, oh, he's got something in him that he's had since childhood, this almost like pathological kindness or whatever. It's more complicated than that, but we'll talk about it. And I think seeing it through Azaka's eyes and then moving into movie 7 is very clever on that level of structure, as you would expect of this project, which is very smart. But it definitely, it is not a filler episode by any means.
No, yes, you're very much right. That and it's fun because it's kind of the nature of Mikia's character, is that I think you need that outside perspective on him for it to like contextualize what he's like. And again, this is a thing that when we get to Fate Stay Night, there's a character that is very similar in that way, and they do some similar things in terms of like trying to find the different lenses with which to look at this character, because you need the contrast to bring out like how abnormal he is in his like weird normality, right? That it's like he is this like painfully normal person, that he's like too normal in terms of he's like too good, he's too kind-hearted, he's too compassionate. And he takes this like to this like kind of almost mundane life to such an extreme that it becomes wrong in some way. I mean, I think that this gives you that perspective. And it's interesting. Again, when we get to Fate Stay Night, we can kind of talk about how some of these story ideas are reused and developed in different ways there. Because it was something I don't think I had realized as much until I rewatched this movie. That's like, oh, he's very much trying out this plot idea that then he does again later. But another thing this movie does is it gives you a different perspective on Shiki post movie 5 that I think is really valuable also, because this is like the most happy Shiki has been in any of these movies, is her going on this little adventure with Mikia's little sister, whom she has an outwardly combative relationship with, but it's clear how much Shiki does like enjoy and care about Azaka. Like, she has a big sister-like relationship with Azaka. And I think there's something really important here about seeing Shiki, how much she has grown and developed as a person, because you can't imagine her doing most of what she does in this movie, just in terms of like the banter and the playfulness she shows at any other point in this series, whether it's like past like high school Shiki or the Shiki of like movie 1 and movie 3 is not at this point yet. And it feels like after movie 5, where through her relationship with Mikia, through her relationship with Tomoe in that movie, and her like, you know, being able to sort of come to some kind of culmination at the end of movie 5, defeating Soden and all of those experiences, that she feels more human here than she has ever felt, I think, in the series.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think part of it also is just putting the weight of the story off of Shiki, which is the first time we've really, like, she's not always the absolute center of the story, but she is usually the person, like, at the very least, getting their hands dirty, and so, like, there's a lot of weight on their shoulders. And so when you take that off, and, like, Shiki is the sidekick in this story. It is Azaka's story. She's narrating. It's her point of view. It's like Shiki has no relationship to the people that Azaka is caring about in this movie, all of that stuff. And so none of that weight is on Shiki. And so when you have her, she can be playing with a cute dog, and she can be listening to her Walkman in bed, and, like, you know, little things like that that are just very funny. You get her, like, using her powers in much more mundane ways. One of my favorite moments in the entire series being her using the Eyes of Mystic Death perception to unlock a cabinet with a ruler, which makes sense by the logic of those powers, right? But it is hilarious, and of course hard to imagine in a different context where she's usually much more up against a wall. And so we don't have that here, and I think that is also just part of the fun, because it's a fun it's weird to say about Shiki, but she can be a very fun character. There are, as you say, those moments of sardonic wit in the other episodes. Obviously, the performance is so good and can go to so many different places that this movie lets it go to just a couple more. And I really like, it's one I'm excited, I'm excited to rewatch all of these at some point. I think movie 6 would play even stronger for me on a second viewing, knowing the whole picture and just knowing, like, the value of, like, kind of spending the time with the characters again. But even then, it just on a first time, it is, as you say, coming off of the intensity of Paradox Spiral. I think it is very smart to have something in between that and A Study in Murder 2, which is also very heavy. So, yeah.
Yeah, this movie is just, like, incredibly pleasant to watch, because I think it's where, I think when you're in the midst of Kara no Kyoukai, it doesn't always feel like you're kind of developing this sort of relationship to the world and the characters because it's so heavy, and the subject material is so intense most of the time. I think it's like when you're in the middle of it, you don't recognize as much as like, oh, I'm developing like an affection for this world and these people the same way you do for like, a TV show you really love, something in the vein of like an X-Files or like a Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you're kind of, monster of the week, like adventure, supernatural detective kind of thing, which is when you peel back a lot of the things that make this very unique, it is there underneath it all. That is kind of like the core of the series. And very intentionally so, because some of those things are like Japanese equivalents of some of those ideas in the novel world, or some of the things that I know, Konatsu has said are some like the big influences on him as a creator. But it's when you get something like this with movie 6 that has like this much like easier plot in terms of like, it's not big, it's not heavy, it's, it is dealing with, people have died. There's like, drug abuse and stuff like that. There's a teacher who has like used drugs to basically blackmail another student. So there is like heavier material, but it is not nearly as intense as the stuff you got in movie 5 with like these characters dying over and over again and being killed by his mother, or like movie 3 dealing with like rape and sexual assault. So it's like it has heavy subject material, but not to the intensity of any of the other parts. It's not suicide and that kind of stuff. It's not as sort of like intense at glaring at that kind of material. So it just gives you this chance to just sort of sit in the world and be with the characters in this lighter, relatively speaking, setting. And it does make you realize that, oh, I love these characters the way I love any characters in a serial format like this. And I think you really feel it in movie 7 where some of that stuff starts going away because it's at the very end. And so you feel this, oh, it's a culmination, and I am happy I was able to have this time in this world with these people, because you're only going to have so much time. So let's have one last go at it, is what movie 6 is. And particularly on a rewatch, it just makes it very, very fun. It's kind of the most fun of all these movies for me.
Yeah, I think it is. We've talked about this a little bit already, but like, it is so amusing to me to look at this show, this series, whatever you want to call it, through the lens of, at its core, it is a like serial fiction case of the week thing, because only movies, this is actually wrong, only really movie 4 doesn't have like a mystery that they are seeking out. Even movie 2 does have it with the serial killer in the background.
Yeah.
Even though Kokutou and Shiki are not in those positions they will be in later. But other than that, movies 1, 3, 5, 6, 7 all have a, more or less case of the week kind of thing going on. And I do like that in movie 6 you get the most straightforward version of it, and that leads to some fun. But it also is still a very thoughtful movie. It is full of sort of, like, even only having seen Kara no Kyoukai, I feel like now I have a good sense of Kinoko Nasu's voice, because it is so overwhelmingly, like, singular and clear. And of course, every one of these chapters, every one of these films so far has sort of picked a theme, an idea, a philosophical framework to kind of look at the world through. And this one is all about memory. That first line of the story is about, I had a dream about my childhood, talking about the past and about memory. The whole plot is about these fairies that don't kill people, but they do steal their memories. And the sort of question being, what happened to this class of people? Is, the villain's overarching goal is to sort of like erase this person's presence from the world through these memories. And then, of course, the other villain, the person who sort of comes from Soren's end of the woods, is someone who can control the world through their words, but also restore people's memories. And so this is one where memory becomes kind of the key theme. And even amidst the fun, I still think you get a lot of those really interesting moments of thinking about the theme in that way that we talked about with movie 5 and with some of the other movies. It's not didactic. It's not like at the end of the movie, Azaka turns to the camera and goes, "And kids, this is what we learned today about memory." It's not like that at all. It is much more like picking a theme and kind of a musical kind of development of it. But I like just, with each one of these, sitting with whatever the chosen idea is for the hour, for the 2 hours, is a very satisfying thing.
Yeah, and I think particularly for this one, it's not just memories. It's like it's memories that have been forgotten, right? And that's the title of the thing, Oblivion Recording, or Oblivion Record is what I always want to call it, because I feel like that's a better translation of what it is. Because it's like it's a Oblivion recording. It's not a recording of Oblivion. It is a record of something that is gone or has been obliviated. And so it's this idea of memories that are forgotten are oblivion. They're nothing. They're gone. They're seemingly gone forever. And so like, what are those memories and how do they affect you? I think is like the part of the big point of the movie. And I think that that's such a interesting idea. It honestly reminds me a lot of the Doctor Who episode Hellbent, which is very much on that exact idea about like what happens to memories when you forget them, and how do like supposedly forgotten memories affect your life now, because they do, right? Whether you remember it actively or not, it has an impact on your life. And you see it very clearly here with Azaka and her love for her brother, how much that is actually a romantic love, or how much she has like kind of misinterpreted her own feelings, I think is up to your interpretation, or something we can talk about. She expresses it as, or understands it in the movie as, being like a romantic love for her brother. That is based on something she can't remember. And then you get these periodic cuts to this dream from the beginning, and then you see the fullness of the dream at the end. That is this like memory that has kind of sublimated into who she is, whether or not she can actively pick it out or not.
Right. And whether even all the details of it are correct, because it is so impressionistic. It is so much like, it's literally like in that first scene I noted, wow, this little girl is talking like an adult. Like, this feels like It's a little off. It doesn't feel like it is an exact, this is documentary of what happened. This is more like a dream, an impression, something like that, where the memory has gone when it has faded, sort of, is the impression I get.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, so let's dive, I guess, specifically in here. And I guess let's talk about Azaka specifically, because we haven't gotten a lot of her. We've seen little bits and pieces. Like, the most we've known is that she's Touko's apprentice, and that she's jealous of Shiki, or is like wary of Shiki's relationship with her brother. And here we get this now fully contextualized as Azaka at the beginning of the movie has this whole speech about like speech in her narration to the audience about how she's in love with her brother. She sees Shiki as a rival in love. A koiteki is what, like, an enemy in love, literally, is what she says. And that I find that it's very endearing. She has like gone through this whole like series of steps in order to try to structure her life such to be able to put her like on an even footing with her brother, right? So she talks about like, oh, I went to my uncle and I lived with him for years and years and years in order to try to remove the association of me being his little sister. And she's like been very like sort of strategic in trying to enact this like very kind of cliche anime thing, which is the little sister that's in love with her older brother. And she has like taken it, as is like typical in Natsu fashion. He's taken this kind of anime archetype, but he's taken it very like seriously into this like logical extreme that you usually don't see it go, where she has like been planning this in this very active way, and then has encountered Shiki, and because she encountered Shiki, that is why she has become Touko's apprentice, so that she can kind of like stand on even footing with Shiki, and has like jumped into this weird world of magic, and she has crossed the boundary specifically out of this like weirdly designed goal, and to be in a relationship with her older brother.
Yes, it is sort of taking like the anime trope to the nth degree in a completely different way. It was kind of funny. I watched this the same day I was catching up on some recent episodes. They won't be recent when this comes out, but from the second half of Spy Family, which kind of inverts in terms of gender the joke here, where you have Yor's little brother who is in the opposing military and he's totally in love with his sister, and they bring it to the nth degree, and it's ultra ridiculous. And I don't know if you've watched the second core yet, Sean, as it's airing, but the jokes get sillier and sillier and sillier. And then I was watching this, which like kind of takes the emotions of that trope and like takes it very, very seriously in a really interesting way, I think. Where like it's not, and it's so different from like, you know, Game of Thrones incest plot where it's all about the like taboo nature of it. Like it really is more like, what is this feeling I have for this older sibling? This like respect? Is it admiration? Is it actual like romantic love? And I think it's interesting. Like it brings you along for the ride because like so many things in Kara no Kyoukai, it takes the underlying idea so seriously, and it's not taking any of it lightly, even though of course there are fun things in this episode.
Yeah, and I think where I like that, to me, it kind of lands in this place where my interpretation of it is that like it's not necessarily romantic love, right? It is a like she has this recognition of her brother and she sees him for who he really is, which is like a truly extraordinary person that nobody else recognizes, right? And she's the only person she knows until she meets Shiki that sees that in him. And I like that idea that like it's this feeling of sort of affection and kind of almost like a nurturing kind of like almost like a motherly kind of thing she has of like, oh, I see who you are and I need to like protect you, is kind of part of her feeling towards her brother, because she knows how much his personality means how much he takes upon himself, like the weight of everything that happens in the world, and how much that compassion is kind of like double-edged. And she has that like urge, and she doesn't know how to interpret that, because it's not a norm, like whatever her feelings, it's not a normal feeling for a little sister towards her older brother. Like it is an abnormal level of affection, even if it's not, I don't think, ever expressed in an explicitly romantic, or certainly not in an explicitly sexual way. As someone who's seen a lot of anime and has seen this trope a lot, I know what it looks like when it is meant to be very explicitly romantic or very explicitly sexual. And when you see that disaster happening in slow motion, which I've seen a few shows do, this is not that. This like takes a very different tack to that kind of approach, and it is very refreshing to watch it. Even though I remembered this, to like rewatch and be like, okay, yes, they're taking this trope, but they're doing it in a way that feels like satisfying. It feels serious while avoiding the kind of pitfalls that often happens, even when a story does take it seriously, but like is too eager to go down the incest rabbit hole, that this is pretty happy to not go down there.
Eager. I'm imagining one of these anime you're talking about, Sean, having just on the front cover of the Blu-ray collection, eager to go down the incest rabbit hole, Sean Chapman, Japanimation Station.
Yeah, you know, there's a couple of shows I've seen that unfortunately, where you think they're not going to go, and then you go to like season 2 or so, you're like, oh, they did. Well, fuck, I can't ever watch this show again. Great.
That's the back of the cover quote. Anyway, yes. Yeah, no, I like Azaka a lot. And I think just the whole idea of like you have, because they also kind of shift the genre a little bit to be like a boarding school story, you know, where we have this school that they're at. We have them in the uniforms. I like that in the uniforms, Shiki and Azaka wind up looking very similar other than their eyes, which is kind of funny. And then, of course, you have Shiki going around doing like normie shit, basically just at the boarding school. And of course, that is very funny, especially because they also gave the characters a cute dog to take care of for the episode. And it is a great dog. I think they named the dog Akira. You learn the dog's name at the end, but it is a good dog. And I like that there's a good dog in this series.
Yes, and the dog animation is very high quality. They put a lot of effort into making that dog look absolutely adorable. And I think one piece you're also missing with like the boarding school thing is it's not just a boarding school, it's like a Catholic boarding school.
Yes.
So they're all in like nun outfits basically without the habit. And yes, and there's like an old church and stuff on school grounds. So definitely I think that's one of the things that takes these sort of like case of the week thing and amplifies that feeling is it's like this is the episode where we go to this like kind of exotic or interesting location. And here's like this Catholic school with like dark secrets lurking therein is such a sort of standard, but like standard because it's such a good setting kind of standard, in both in like Japanese fiction and in English language fiction. It's a pretty kind of typical location to go to when you're running through different kinds of locations, for your kind of serial mystery story. And that's just something that's very fun, is getting your characters in the uniform, skulking around the school grounds. And, it's during a vacation or holiday period, so there aren't any other normal students around while they're investigating. It gets this very kind of special feeling that none of the other movies really have, other than like movie 2, which is set in the past, where it is all designed around such a like specific world, this like school that is just totally different than anywhere else we have ever been, partially because it's like normal. It's normal, relatively speaking, for Kata no Kyoukai. It's not a giant crazy like labyrinth of death. It's not like this haunted suicide building. It's just like a school that people go to that happens to be Catholic because it's an anime.
Happens to be Catholic, and I think they have fun with, like, I don't think it ever gets as thematized as I thought it might, and that's fine, but it does, like, I think most Japanese characters walking into a Catholic school would be fairly befuddled, because that's just not, like, the national religion or anything, right? But I think I can't imagine many anime protagonists who would be less equipped to go to a Catholic school than Shiki, and it is funny, the, like, little moments of culture shock you get throughout the episode, and I enjoy all of that quite a bit.
Yes.
Like, Shiki is the person who has, explained to us that if God can die, she can kill it. Like, or if God exists, she can kill it. Like, she does not necessarily fit in at this Catholic institution.
Yes, definitely not. And like the church, like Nasu, like most great Japanese creatives, really loves using like the church and the Catholic Church purely just for the aesthetic value of it, and does not give a shit about anything else. And we will learn that very well in Fate. It's true in Tsukihime as well, that it's just like, hey, sometimes having like the Catholic Church be this like ominous thing that exists in your series, and using like the signifiers of like Judeo-Christian religion, but just not giving a shit about anything deeper than that, that's super fun. And luckily, like, there is not an obnoxious fan base around Fate like there is with Eva that tries to read too much into it every time. Everybody into Fate, because everybody into Fate knows, like, yeah, no, the weird, like, assassin priest with, like, knives shaped like crosses, there's nothing deeper going on there. It's just because it's fucking cool.
Right, it would be like reading Castlevania and like, oh, he's throwing the crosses in this scene. What does that... I mean, obviously that comes from Dracula, but they do kind of hype it up in the games a little bit in the same way, right? Yeah. No, it's fun, and I like it. There's this scene where I think Azaka is getting, she's getting Tachibana's report, like on her disappearance, and she makes thanks and does the cross on her chest, and I found that very interesting because it's like very rehearsed, and it's just, there's stuff like that I find fun in this episode. But yeah,
there are lots of little details like that that's kind of sprinkled throughout.
Moreover, there's so many good visual gags in this one, particularly anything with the two of them in their little dorm room with the bunk beds. There's one gag in particular where Azaka leaves early, like she's going to part of the investigation, and Shiki doesn't get up because Shiki's, just not getting out of bed yet. And then after she closes the door, finally Shiki wakes up, but they animate it so you also see the dog getting out of bed from the bottom bunk at the exact same moment, but we didn't know the dog was in the bottom bunk. He just like pops out from under the covers. It's the biggest laugh this whole series got out of me, I think.
Yeah, that one's good. I really just like all of Shiki and Azaka's back and forth. There's the part where like Shiki, has sussed out like Azaka's weird feelings for Mikia, and she calls it out kind of out of nowhere. And then during that conversation, it's when Shiki calls her a pervert.
Yes.
She just like says, "Call me hentai man."
I have it in my notes. She says, "It's Azaka is explaining. I love things that are special. Rather, I seem to be attracted to things that are taboo." And then Shiki goes, "Kono hentai." It's fucking great.
Like, you pervert. And it's, there's something about Sakamoto Maya's delivery that it's so like undersold. It's so dry. And I think it's because you hear that specific, it's a very standard kind of like comedic retort in Japanese, particularly in anime, to call someone a pervert. But usually it's like such a, extreme, like someone screaming at the top of their lungs, because usually it's like Master Roshi has groped a lady or something. That's kind of the classic time you'd hear this word. And so there's something about the very subtle, sardonic way that Shiki says it cracks me up so much. Then my other favorite bit in the whole thing, and it just works so well because Azaka is the first kind of like cute character we've had that you get more in like something like a Tsukihime or Fate Stay Night because they're visual novels, but you don't really get it like a character that feels, oh, this is a cute character, kind of Kyoukai. But Azaka is very cute and she's very fun. She's kind of like a tsundere archetype, so she's playing on some of those things. And there's the part where she has passed out and she wakes up and sees Shiki and she freaks out and she like does all these crazy gestures and then she just lands on punch and she tries to punch Shiki and Shiki just like very casually without even trying moves her head out of the way, dodges it and lets go of Azaka. Azaka falls backwards and hits her head on the fountain or whatever. Like there's something about that exchange that it plays off of this sort of like cute girls messing around thing that is like something you'd expect from like a Kyoto animation thing. Whenever we do that topic, we'll have the episode where I have to try to define what moe means. We're not quite there yet, even though there is a moe joke in the claymation thing, but we're not having that conversation because I need to research and prepare for that one. But this hits on some of that kind of adorableness that you get in their interactions, and particularly with Azaka. And that's that one. There's something about the way that she says the English word punchy, that she tries. Right. She's like trying to figure out what should I do? Like, what is the appropriate reaction to have in this scenario? If you get like 10 seconds of her trying to process that, and the fact that she lands on trying to just punch her straight up in the face and it not working is very funny.
I have in my notes, it's just all caps the word punch and then a bunch of exclamation points, because I did love that moment as well. And yes, the word punch in Japanese is always just a little funny because you say it, punchy. And of course, if you're a good comedic voice actress, you're going to like put a spin on it and it's going to be extra funny. And yes, the whole setup of that gag is fantastic.
Yes. But this whole episode is just full of little moments like that, which again, I don't think we've ever talked about, oh, this made me laugh.
No.
In another episode of Kanano Kyoukai. Even though, again, I think there are moments where I've kind of chuckled. There's been like a funny Shiki line here or there. It's not a feature, whereas this one, it's like there are multiple scenes. It's like, yeah, this got a good chuckle out of me. But
I think it's a good balance of it. Like, it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb as like, this is the hard left turn into high comedy that you might get in some cases is done like kind of intentionally. Like Kimetsu no Yaiba loves making just to name another UFO table thing, the really hard turns between like comedy and drama. I still think like this has enough of all the other sort of things you come to Kara no Kyoukai for that it feels like a smooth transition, and because it is so localized around the perspective of Azaka as a person, I think that helps it too. Like one of the first moments I noted in my notes is just early on when she's explaining her whole thing, like who she is. I love her line, "You could call me an angst-ridden maiden," is a fucking great introduction to that character. But she's talking about her whole backstory, and then you see this scene where she comes into Kokutou's apartment and she sees Kokutou and Shiki at a table under the heating pad. They've got their legs under the heating pad at the table together, and it's doing two things. Like, one, it is clearly picking up on the end of Paradox Spiral with that, now Shiki is ready to come over to Kokutou's house as well, right? And she can come over uninvited. She has a key. But also we're seeing her through Azaka's POV, so you can't quite trust how normal the scene looks, right? It looks like just from like another anime, just a slice of life thing. Oh, here are two friends, and this is the girl I'm jealous of. And of course, none of the added context of like, Shiki was comatose for 2 years after possibly murdering several people, and she has the mystic eyes of death perception, blah, 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 right? And I think that the two sides of that are very funny, because clearly it is meant to invoke that, like, yes, she and Kokutou are having a more and more normal relationship, but also I think you are seeing it, like, heightened by a couple of degrees by it being the little sister coming in and seeing it.
Yes, very much so. And that is like the transition that they're able to do to make the comedy work is by having it be through the lens of this other character. And yes, I do think that you're meant to understand that lots of the things that she sees or how she interprets things is through this more kind of normative lens. Even if she is technically a mage, right? She is technically a part of this world. She's only sort of, put her little pinky toe in as Touko's apprentice. She's not really on this side yet of the boundary. And so I think it is meant to color how you understand a lot of what is happening through her POV.
Yeah. So in terms of the main plot, they're looking into this stuff with fairies and the incident with this girl, Tachibana. We sort of have two antagonists to this episode. We have a pink-haired senpai at the school named Oji, who we learn is also using magic and is controlling the fairies. And then we have Satsuki, who is the teacher who looks like Mikia, who is actually named Godot Word, and he is a magus. His full name I wrote down. It's Godot Word Mayday, which is a name worthy of a Mobile Suit Gundam character. Just a fantastic name. But I was wondering if you could maybe briefly run through the plot of this, just in case there's any hosts on this show who didn't 100% follow it, because it is, like a lot of these, very complicated on first watch.
Yeah, this one is complicated, and this is one I wish that I had time to read the book version of, because from what I understand, some of the reason why this one is particularly feels a little bit confusing is because I think they cut material out. Like, I know, for instance, that Oji, the Mizuki Nana character, the student council president, I don't know if she's actually student council president. I know but she is, whether she literally is or not, I don't remember if they say that in the movie. She's just the student council president character, regardless of whether or not there's a student council president. I don't know if Catholic schools even have student councils. I've never been to one. But that character, I know, is meant to kill, or in the novels, kills the Word of God guy, Kurogiri, at the end. And so there's a whole kind of other side to the plot that I guess they cut down, probably just to focus it predominantly on Azaka. And I think it feels like they probably cut stuff out from the novel that I suspect was told from other POVs in order to really just kind of focus this on that main part. But it does mean that I do think the core plot, the mystery of this, is a bit confusing. But what it effectively is that the Godot Word, that mage, is at this school just to fuck around, I think, is more or less what you find out, right? Like, was brought here by Soren in order to give Shiki's memories back in Soren's attempt to try to awaken the mystic eyes of death perception and control Shiki and all that kind of stuff. And obviously all this is now happening after Soren's dead, so that's his role is done.
Yeah, he has some very fun lines near the end where he's expositing to Shiki, and he says, "I guess you could say I'm killing time. One needs entertainment to live. If living is all you have, you are no different than a machine." So he's literally talking about this whole scenario like it's him, playing his Game Boy in the corner, waiting for an appointment to start. It's a very evil way of seeing the world.
Yeah, and he's just using his ability to alter people's perception of things in order to push everything to an extreme. The reason why Oji is able to control these fairies is because of him. He has given her that ability. And then sort of part of the main mystery is that this girl, Tachibana, died, and she died in this gruesome way where she set the old classroom building on fire while she was inside of it and was killed. And she was having weird, seeming hallucinations and stuff like that, where she was running out of classrooms screaming that the fairies are coming, the fairies are going to get me, and all this stuff that created all these rumors around the school about these fairies that are stealing people's memories. I believe at that point, there weren't actually any fairies involved. I think that is something that he only gave Oji that power later.
Yeah, we find that out later. The fairies are a narrative thing kind of added on top later because it seems like it could be true, but it isn't. That was made clear in the movie to me, yeah.
Yes, because that was her having withdrawal symptoms because she was drugged by this teacher, whom she stumbled upon him using drugs in the school. And we know that this teacher has disappeared and he was clearly involved in something shady. That's all stuff you get at the beginning of the movie. You find out kind of the process of events was he was doing drugs and stuff at the school. He was caught by the student. In order to blackmail her and basically shut her up so that she wouldn't tell anybody else, he forcibly injected her with heroin or whatever he was using, and got her addicted. And her trying to sort of deal with the withdrawal from that and deal with that sort of feeling of being tainted or whatever, right? Because this is also a girl going to a Catholic high school. She ultimately ends up killing herself by setting the building on fire. Oji, I think, is meant to be in love with her. Or considers her a very good friend, depending on how much you want to read romance into it. I read it as being, it's a classic Catholic girls' school. They're in love with each other. And so she sort of blames everybody else in that class for her death because they didn't say anything. So she is now using her fairy powers to make those people disappear and have nobody else basically even notice about it. And gets almost to the point of making them all set themselves on fire in that building before Azaka realizes that's what's happening, because also her perception of things has been altered, because the first time she goes into that building, she sees that half of it isn't even there. And she's like, what the fuck? And then she leaves, and then she realizes, oh, this is all crazy memory fairy shit. And she goes back and discovers that, no, all those people have been there, and they're about to light themselves on fire.
But she goes back in. I really like this moment. She goes back in listening to classical music on the Walkman.
Yes.
Which is a nice planting and payoff moment, because Shiki was like dicking around with it earlier. And then now Azaka is like intentionally listening to it. And Satsuki, who we learn is Go.Word, tries to stop her, but she's listening to the music, doesn't hear anything, it goes on. And so she isn't under his influence, because he's able to like alter the world with his words.
Yes, because earlier when she went to go investigate the school, he told her you won't find anything there. So she literally doesn't find anything there. So she's not able to perceive what she's meant to see. And then she fights Oji and defeats all the fairies. I think she realizes that Oji's like, she also is being manipulated by Go.Word, so she doesn't kill her or anything. Then Shiki has her encounter with Go.Word, who awakens her memories and then walks away. And again, in the novel, my understanding is that Oji then kills him in another scene.
I think they made the right call. I mean, again, I have not read it. You haven't read it. It sounds like to me they probably made the right call cutting this down, because if you had that other material, this would have to run over an hour. And I think it would be weird if this one ran longer than episodes 1 through 4. I think an hour is like comfortable. I think if it were any longer, I think this one would start to feel too thin. And I think focusing it in on the characters that we really care about and have had already is fine. Like those seem like the smart kinds of cuts to make if you're adapting a book, especially into this kind of format where you're either doing sort of 1 hour movies or 2 hour movies. I don't think an 80-minute version of this would have worked as well.
Yeah, I think like the mystery as it stands is understandable. Yes. It's just like not the attraction of the movie. Like it's put in the background. So it's like if you want to focus on all the details, you can pull all the details out. But if you're not focusing on the details, I think you just kind of ignore them. But you're able to just get into the flow of like, oh yeah, no, this like a mage dude, he's the bad guy. OG seems like the bad guy, but maybe she's actually just tragically misunderstood. And like you can feel the emotions of those plot beats and get the character stuff because your real focus is on Shiki and Azaka and their relationship and what's going on there. And that's where the movie is placing emphasis. So it's like not particularly important. I think that the core mystery is not as compelling as maybe it is in like movie 3 or movie 5, where that's more of an emphasis on what's happening.
They even lampshaded, I think, an interesting moment where you have Touko in the car with Mikia, and they're talking about the case, and they get a call and all of that. And Mikia is kind of like, maybe you should go sort this out. This sounds serious. And Touko is like, it's fine. It's not that serious. If Azaka can't handle this, she can't be my apprentice anyway. And I love the implication that Touko knows, like, I could walk in there and solve this in a fucking second. This is not a serious case by our standards here at our detective agency. But I need to give the kids something to do, and I think that alone like puts it in the right valence.
Yes, because one thing there is that scene is not in a car. That's they're at a fucking like family dinner, family restaurant.
That's a great scene.
Yes. Yeah, because right after she says that, like, the food comes and she's like, let's eat.
Yes.
And Miki is just, like, exasperated at this. She's just, like, really happy to have whatever fucking meal she's having at this restaurant.
They're like a novelty restaurant. It's great. Yeah.
Yeah, that little moment is great because, yes, this is a thing where if, like, Touko got her, like, crazy demon in a box or whatever the fuck she used to kill Alba in movie 5 and showed up at the school's doorsteps, this would be over very, very quickly. But this doesn't require her to do that. She's using this as Azaka's mentor, as, like, giving her space to kind of grow and develop on her own.
Yes, and I think in that mode it works. And yeah, I don't think the plot is actually that confusing. From what like we just talked through, I followed all of that. I was kind of curious, is there more to it that I missed? And it sounds like there really wasn't. It is, I think it's like a lot of things in Kara no Kyoukai, it's a little more straightforward than it's presented to you as, because it's always presented a little out of sequence or whatever. But yeah, I like the way it all comes together. Speaking of that scene where, you go in the building that has burned, and the first time they go, it's like fucking bombed out like World War II, and they're, looking out at the half the building is missing and all of that. And then the second time you go in and it's not bombed out, but it has burned. Something that this one made me notice, and it is true in all 7 of these movies, but I just noticed it even more in this one because I think it's extra strong. And it's something worth talking about as we get into all this Ufotable stuff, and I don't think we've mentioned it yet, is Ufotable has, like, uniquely beautiful background art in their works.
Yes.
It's something they are really, really good at, and it's like, they have some of the most detailed background animation that I have ever seen, and there's several different flavors of what I would call, like, detailed background art. Like, Makoto Shinkai probably is, like, the king of this right now in the theatrical space, where his movies have, like, hyper detailed, like almost obsessively detailed background art that just gets every little finicky detail of like life in Tokyo or something like that. And that's not quite what Ufotable does. They often go for like a slightly softer sort of like pencil work or color scheme, or like it's not quite abstract at any point. It is very like detailed, but it's just a little softer. But just the like mix of colors and the amount of detail they put in there, it often feels like it's punching above its weight in whatever medium it's in. Like, I remember watching the first episodes of Kimetsu no Yaiba and going, those look like movie backgrounds. Those do not look like TV backgrounds. It's just something they're very good at, and clearly using some, like, you know, digital techniques to enhance all of that. But it's something that I think is a signature of that studio, where I can tell an Ufotable work from their backgrounds. I noticed that from the very beginning of Kara no Kyoukai, having seen Kimetsu, is like, oh, there is a commonality here.
Yeah, their backgrounds are, you're right, always very good. And I think a big thing is that they're also just so good at using the backgrounds and then the way that they stage scenes, and especially when they get to do some of their stuff with like the more 3D camera movements, they're so good at giving a sense of place and location. And that's what I think we come back to sometimes with this of, you know, like Shiki's apartment room, which is just like a very normal little location that would be in any other anime. But there's something about the way it looks and the way that they do sequences there that you get such a lived-in sense of the space there. And I think it's true of like the school in this movie. I think it's true of like that scene you pointed out where you get that beautiful like vista over the hill and everything. And also the climax of this movie is incredibly memorable to me because there's something about the fight in the church that Azaka has that location feels so real. Like it feels very like tangible. And I think a lot of that is like the amount of detail of what they put into the background. They're so good at creating a sense of sort of three-dimensional depth, whether it's literally a 3D background or shots where it isn't a 3D background, but they still give the image a sense of depth that gives you that sense of location. And I think that's true of like all of their stuff. We'll see it in Fate for sure, which is important there because it's adapting a visual novel. You're taking like images that are very like burned into the audience's head if they played the games, because you've seen the images, the CG images of those locations in the game over and over again. So it's like, oh, here's the bridge. I've seen that bridge 1,000 times when I played that game. You've got to get that location right, you know? And then it's in Kimetsu no Yaiba, if you think about any of those movies, it was one of the fun things about playing, or the show and then the movie, one of the fun things about playing the game was how much it felt like, oh, I get to be in this spot from the TV show because that space, the forest that he fights the spider demon in, is very distinctive and very like kind of iconic feeling location because of how lived in it is. So yeah, it is I think a trademark of the studio, and it's been true so far in Kara no Kyoukai, and we'll definitely continue to see that in the rest of the stuff we'll watch.
I think it's maybe an underrated aspect of why they are so good at the 3D stuff is because they are so good before you ever jump into 3D at just the basic spatial awareness and building an interior geography and giving a good sense of what this space is through your normal, you know, background layer, cell layer, all of that stuff, which can be hard to do in animation because animation is like this. You kind of have a limited camera, limited perspective with traditional animation. And so developing a space, particularly I think an interior space, can be difficult to do well. They do it very well. And so when you jump into 3D in any of these, I feel like you always do that at a point where you know the space already, or a 3D shot will be your intro to the space, as we sometimes get like with the paradox spiral, some of the stuff inside the apartment building because it is so complicated. But, you know, it makes like, you know, in episode 19 of Kimetsu no Yaiba, when Tanjiro jumps into action and the crazy shit starts in this, you know, infamous sequence, we know that area of the forest that he is in very, very intimately, and they are able to maintain that aesthetic and then, you know, leverage our knowledge of the space to make it all the more awe-inspiring. And that's something this one absolutely does with the church at the end. Very, very much so.
Yeah, that church fight is just like, you know, burned into my memory. I don't mean to use that as a pun because obviously that's Asuka's, she has like fire magic or whatever. But that's one of those ones that like when I think about great Ufotable action scenes, that's one that always comes to mind. It's that shot of Azaka like running on the top of the pews, dodging the fairies, is just one of those. That's a fucking Ufotable sequence. Like, it's just, you look at that and you can put that next to any of their other really great action scenes, like some of the stuff in movie 5, the stuff we've seen in Kimetsu no Yaiba. It's like, yes, like that shit is rad. All their crazy effects on the fire and the effects with the fairies are super cool. I love Azaka's weird, crazy, like, magic glove she has to cast her fire spells. Like, all it's just like, it's very like Fate or like Nasu. Obviously, it's not literally Fate, but it's like that kind of action scene and that kind of magic, and then it's Ufotable bringing that to life very full-throatedly.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the ending to this movie, because it is my favorite part. Just the revelation of like what Asuka's memory is, and it's her thinking about like there was a death in their family, and they were at the funeral. And the primal memory, she talks about, you know, under the starry night, we siblings looked up at the stars. That was my primal scene, a dream of the distant past I shouldn't have remembered. Love this stuff. It's the writing, even in translation. I feel like whoever's translating it, Nasu's voice is so fucking clear. I just am getting a sense of that more and more and more. But really the piece of dialogue I love here, and this is what rattled around in my head throughout movie 7, was her saying about her brother, his strength touched my heart, he is normal to the maximum, and he is the last person to hurt anyone else. He can understand everyone, but no one notices him. What an empty loneliness. I feel like they would have been justified having like an echo of that line over the final scene in movie 7 if they wanted to do it. That would be a little hacky, but it also like, it's so perfect to like where Kokutou is going and why Shiki is the person to go there with him, that like that is the moment where this movie like fully locks in for me, like this is essential Kara no Kyoukai.
Yeah, because it's that thing where Mikia, I think the nature of who he is as a character is he's very hard to get a handle on, because he's like, in most ways, he feels unremarkable. Certainly next to Shiki and Touko. You know, he doesn't have the mystic eyes of death perception. He's not fighting ghosts on a rooftop with a robot arm. He can't die and then have a puppet that also owns the same red fucking sports car again, drive up with a demon in a box and eat a crazy man in a top hat who came from London. You know, like, he's not that dude. He's the guy who's bleeding on the ground because that same man in the top hat from London beat his fucking skull into like the stone mosaic over and over and over again. Like, if there's any remarkable thing about Mikia, it's something I do love that movie 7 does bring up, is that he could take a lot of punishment. You know, you could kick the shit out of this dude and he'll keep going. You know, he's got a very thick skull. But it's like, he's not a crazy action hero. He's not saving the world. Like, he's like very definitively not that person. He's never that person. He's never getting into physical fights with people and winning or anything. It is just purely he's very smart, right? So we see that, and it's more less that he's smart, it's more that he's incredibly diligent, right? That's what makes him so good in the Hollow Shrine or whatever, when they're investigating crimes, is he does all the research, right? He brings up all of the people who like lived in that crazy apartment complex, and he was very frustrated because you could only get 30 out of the 50 people, and then later we learned that, well, there were only 30 families, the other ones were fake. You know, so it's less that he's a genius and more that he just works really hard. He's very diligent. He just tries at it. And he's very like open-hearted and very compassionate. He will always take everybody's side. He's always trying to find the best way to resolve things. In movie 3, even though he is morally disgusted by, I think his name was Kato or whatever, like the guy who's part of that, the kind of the gang that raped Fujino, he's disgusted by them, but he's still not going to just let that dude get killed. He's still going to try to help, even though it is, you know, he recognizes how awful those people are. And there's something about his sort of simple, diligent goodness to such an extreme that is like, it's off. Like, he takes it to such an extreme that there's something off about him. And it was something that was very satisfying when, in like, I think the first episode we recorded of this, where you identified that, Jonathan. I thought that was interesting, because I don't know, I probably would have, but I couldn't remember at what point I like noticed that characterization. And so it was like interesting to me to see like, okay, yes, even someone who's has no experience with this recognizes that that's like an intentional thing about his character, is that there's something weird about how far he takes it. And most other people don't seem to key in on that in this world. Other people in Mikia's world don't necessarily always notice that about him, but like Azaka does, and she sees it, and she sees what kind of effect it must have underneath all of the stuff. You know, the fact that he never cries on the outside. I think she sees like how much of an effect it must have on him inside, and that's what triggers this like obsession with her brother that she has.
Yeah, and because absolutely, I remember talking about that with movie 2 specifically, which is Kokuto's in movie 1 a little bit, but he's mostly in a coma on the couch. Yes. So, movie 2 is effectively our introduction to him. And I remember being like, in that movie, like, whatever's going on with Shiki, I am almost finding Kokutou even weirder for being the guy who sees the woman standing, bathing in someone's blood, and then comes back, Like, there's something about that that's really interesting and off. And I think this is where we get it vocalized. And it speaks to, like, the authorial just masterfulness of this as a project, of seeding that characterization through these opening... through the bulk of the project, through these first 5 chapters, and then at the end of this 6th chapter, through a character we haven't seen much before, coming in and verbalizing that for us in a way that, like, feels both revelatory and just utterly right. Like, oh, that's it. It's like scratching the itch a little bit. And I love that about it, because this is a character type who I think can and often does go very wrong. There is something about... Yes. I think Kokutou could very easily be the author insert character. And you get this in Japanese works, you get this in American works, you get it all over the world, of if you have your sort of like straight white guy author or any, ethnicity, but of like the, sort of like dominant caste or whatever. And you have, they are sort of inserting themselves through the main character, who is totally normal, and also like maybe like too normal, too good, too kind of squeaky clean, but then, and like not very interesting. And then there is the girl character who is the most interesting person in the entire world, and somehow that girl kind of is pulled down to this dude's level. Probably the best version of this, or worst version, but best as an example, is like Xander in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. If you want like
I was thinking the exact same thing.
Yeah, like, and Joss Whedon does this in all his shows, but like in Buffy, it's like super duper obvious, and I think Kokutou could fall in that direction very easily. And I don't think there's any, especially because in movie 7, it's weird to say he gets the girl in the end, because he gets the girl covered in blood with one of his eyes missing and his leg like in fucking tatters and all of this, and she's like, lying feet away from a corpse that she has completely dismembered. So it's not quite like a Hollywood, they're running across and meeting at a bridge and embracing. But it is, the romantic fulfillment ending, and I think it speaks to the quality of the writing, that this does not feel like an authorial insert sort of self-masturbatory thing. It feels like this is a character that, Kinoko Nasu finds as interesting as Shiki, and treats as interestingly in very different ways, even though one of them on the surface is much more flashy and like attention-grabbing. I think movie 2 was the real nexus of that for me, and I think they continue it throughout.
Yeah, and if people want, like, for that kind of character archetype in anime of, like, where it is often done poorly, that is, like, the albatross around the neck of the isekai genre,
yes.
Effectively, here is, like, the normal dude who gets transported to the fantasy world, and he's remarkable because when he got transported, he became invincible, or, my magic stat is 1,000, and I'm reincarnated in another world. And that's like the title of the show, and that's what the premise is, and all like the hot ladies are into him because he's just like that dude.
That's Ready Player One in American context. It's the exact same thing, yeah.
Yeah, it's part of the core fantasy, the isekai stuff. It's like one of the things that Sword Art Online had to like realize very quickly after the first story arc was like, oh, we can't actually make Kirito, the main character of a story arc ever again. Because as soon as you try to, it just doesn't work, because we used him up, and then like he's too boring a main character to ever use. He works fine for the first story arc, but then as soon as you try to use him as the main character again, it doesn't work. So they have to keep on introducing a more interesting other character that the next story arc is really about. And Kirito's just kind of there to help. And once they get onto that formula, that series got like better again. But it's a thing that you see a lot in anime. Particularly now that like the isekai thing is so popular, and that there's something extremely refreshing about going back and getting Kokutou, and him, obviously this is not an isekai, but getting that kind of like, here's a character that feels like they can be an author insert, feels like they're like the harem romance protagonist archetype dude that's just like generically nice, but taking that character and those characteristics more seriously and seeing where they go. And this being, so old, like the original, while the movies aren't that old, the original story is from like 1997, 1998, which you feel particularly in a movie 7, which feels like a very 90s movie with the stalker serial killer stuff. But like, there's something nice about seeing this archetype done so well in a relatively old story for this kind of medium. And it's like, man, I wish more stuff kind of learned from Kokutou or learn from the main character in Fate Stay Night is a broadly similar kind of deconstruction of a similar sort of character archetype. And I wish that more modern anime did stuff like this, because there's something very dull about having your main character be completely vacuous, which lots of main characters typically are. I
mean, it's ultimately a story about two damaged people whose damage turns out to be complementary, And that is not the author self-insert thing in like an isekai show, right? You would not typically get to the end and go, this person is kind of fucked up. Kokutou's ultimate act of heroism is being, frankly, overly self-destructive, and like all these things. And it's very interesting and dynamic. And I can feel us moving on to movie 7 here. Is there anything else to say about movie 6?
It's fun. It's a fun one, man. I had a big smile on my face for most of it, which is like not necessarily the expression I usually have on my face, even though I enjoy all of Kokutou no Kyoukai tremendously. It's not always like a smile kind of thing, but this one is.
Yeah. I have to shout out the Claymation short every single time. This one's great. It involves Shiki giving a girl super mints, and that girl then summons fire to make I say a girl. It's Azaka, clearly. It's Azaka. I did not know when I started taking my notes. But then Azaka uses her fire magic. She's making popcorn. Then Shiki uses her knife to stop the flame. Kokutou is caught in the middle, and then they fall in love. And then the message is, fire is prohibited. Get charred without burning, which is a fantastic log line, and I love it.
Yes, and again, I'm not going to have the Moe talk yet. That's for a future episode of Japanimation Station one day. But I will just point out that it is a Moe joke is what they're making, because Moeru means to burn.
Yes.
They're using that, and they like put it in like a pink font or whatever. And so they're setting up the idea that this is the Moe cute episode of Kokutou no Kyoukai right from the get-go with the Claymation short.
The final chapter, part 7, has its Claymation short, which is Kokutou bringing ice cream to the movie theater, the Haagen-Dazs strawberry. He and Shiki enjoy their treat. They hold hands. It's very cute, a little indication of where we're going, and then all the characters are there. There's no real gag to this one. It's just fun, and it tells you to please mind your manners and watch the finale. And it's a nice little intro to the episode.
Yeah, that one's fun for if you're a big fan of like all of the Type Moon stuff, to just freeze frame like the last shot of the whole movie theater that's just full of like clay figures, and some of them just look like off-the-shelf action figures of some of the characters and stuff, and like there are some really obscure characters in there too, and it's fun to freeze frame and be like, this movie was like, what, 2009? I'll be like, man, I didn't even realize this character had been in anything in 2009 yet. It's like, oh, they're in like the background of this manga spin-off of this other thing, because they were only referenced one time in the like underplayed sequel to Fate Stay Night, the visual novel sequel, Fate Hall Attraction. It's like, oh my god, I didn't even there's some very deep cuts in that freeze frame at the very end.
It's good. And then we get the full movie. It's 2 hours long. It's the longest of these. A Study in Murder, Part 2, Part B, whatever you want to call it. It's the second one. It's also the final episode. And this one's a slow burn. I think this one is challenging. Yeah. It is brutal. And then I think the last 40 minutes or so are just a tour de force. I think it would be fair to say. That's maybe an overused term. I think it would apply here.
Yeah, I mean, this one thing that's interesting is this one is by far, other than the eighth movie, which that's obviously a kind of a different situation, this is the longest it took them to make a movie, because I know that this one was delayed multiple times in production, because I don't think they probably initially thought of it as a 2-hour movie is kind of the implication I saw, because I read some interviews with Nasu and Takashi Takeuchi, the artist at Type Moon, talking about some of the production stuff, because movie 6 came out in December 20th, 2008. This movie came out August 8th, 2009. So that's like almost a year.
Yeah, and there was a recap special in the middle. They did they put that out, so you can find that. It's not on the Crunchyroll stream, but it's included in most of the other releases that like goes through the first 5 and is kind of their recap special sort of thing to fill the time.
Yeah, because this is like, one thing that's interesting is if you're just going by page counts, again, I didn't read the full chapter, so I can't speak to like where this comes from in an adaptational thing. But if you're just looking at page counts, the ratio is like, this is the second longest chapter, but this was, in my digital version, was like 350 pages with the font I was using, and this Paradox Spiral was 500. But this is a little bit longer than Paradox Spiral. So I think there's something must have happened at some point in production where they realized like this movie like needs more space as a movie than it maybe seems like on the page in adaptation, is like the impression I get from watching the movie, seeing like some of the interviews and seeing some like the production stuff and that how long it took them to come out. The fact that they had to put out that like recap thing in order to try to fill that gap in that 9-month basically break between the movies. And I do think that instinct was very right. Like, this movie is by far the most slow burn. Like, it does not have anywhere near like the convoluted plotting of Paradox Spiral, where you can't imagine that movie being any shorter than it is, because like the plot demands it to be pretty long. Whereas this movie's like very simple. It doesn't have any more complicated a plot than any of the other movies. It is, here's the murders have started up again. Shiki has gone off to investigate them on her own, basically off screen for the first half of the story. So the first half is Mikia investigating it, going down this rabbit hole of like these drugs. And he's putting all the pieces together. It's revealed that the murderer is this character Dio, who you saw a little bit in movie 2. And he's been the killer the whole time. We also saw him in the post-credit scene in movie 6 that sets up all this stuff as well, where you see his first kill, which that's also a fucking great scene. But you find out that it's Dio. They put it together. Mikia confronts him. Then Shiki has to go fight him at this like old warehouse. Mikia goes there, and ultimately Dio is killed. Shiki and Mikia are reunited, and then afterwards, they have sort of completed their character arcs, and they are like a unit, and they are together. It's like, that's not a particularly complicated plot. You could get that plot through in an hour movie pretty easily, I think. But this movie really wants you to sit and feel like every moment in that journey, and feel, I think, like the isolation, particularly of the two characters in that long first half that is about they're separated, they're investigating this murder separately. You're more with Mikia than you are with Shiki, though you do get some stuff with Shiki in there. And I think that like loneliness in that first half of the movie is so intense. And I think you only get that with like the amount of time. I think it's something where in the middle of this movie, I totally had lost track of how much time had passed, how deep I was into the movie, even though I've seen it before and I know where the plot ends and like where we get to at the end. I think there's like a malaise that exists in that section of the film that is very effective, because it like, you just get lost in everything with the characters.
To some degree, it's like the anti-Paradox Spiral, in that it is not a complex story told complexly. It is a relatively, for Kara no Kyoukai, not relatively for like stories in general, but for this series, it is a relatively simple story told relatively simply. Like, I think the direction is brilliant, and it uses a lot of like this. If you like weird anime camera angles where you just people are talking and you are seeing weird sort of abstract angles on them, or them reflected in interesting surfaces or anything like that, you are gonna love Kara no Kyoukai movie 7, because they go to town on it in a way that like Ufotable is good at, and I think this material lends itself to very, very well. But it isn't like there's none of the like standout, Paradox Spiral-esque, oh my god, they're breaking the boundaries of animation with this scene. In fact, I think intentionally the fight sequences between Ryo and Shiki go for a more simple sort of animatic front-on like 2D sort of planar fight thing, and I think that's very intentional to kind of tell us where we are in this movie. And it really is about sort of lingering in the core questions and mysteries of what this series is about. And I think it gives you the space to not just live with all of that, to build atmosphere, to do those things, to let character moments breathe. But I think also for the viewer to marinate in it and come to, while they're watching, conclusions or at least fuller thoughts on like, okay, well, this is a massively complicated project, I think, when you look at all the themes and all the ideas it brings forward. Now we're at the end. This is the final chapter. What was this thing about? And I think you see in the kind of circularity of it, it kind of starts circling around ideas of, like, what is it to murder? What is it to kill? The opposite of that is always going to be, what is it to live? And then it is these two characters. What is their specific damage? What is it that is driving these two people, and why do they belong together at the end? And I think the length allows for that in a way that you could absolutely probably do the 1 hour or 90-minute version of this, and I just don't think it would hit anywhere near as hard, because this is the end, and I think you do need to give the audience time to work through that while they're watching it.
Yeah, and it's just, there's such a thick sense of atmosphere that you have always had with Kara no Kyoukai, but I think it's like, but you've never been able to sit in it as much as this movie. I think the closest is just because of the relative complexity of the plot to the rest of the film is movie one. And this kind of, some of that tone, I feel like you kind of go back to a little bit that space that movie one was in, of Shiki walking the city at night alone. And here you mostly see it as Mikia, and you're with Mikia as he wanders the city at night alone. And movie one, that while that movie is not that long, there's also not that much that happens. So like Shiki walking around at night takes up a comparatively pretty large stretch of that movie's runtime. And similarly, I think like this is a much more complicated plot than movie one, even if it's nowhere near as complicated as movie five. But I think it needs a similar kind of ratio of like, you just need to sit in the atmosphere to think about the ideas, to contemplate what's going on, and then also to sit with these characters and feel their separation. These two people that like, they know and and everybody knows like needs to find a way to come together, but they just cannot seem to do it for most of the movie until you need what happens at the end for them to be able to kind of break through and both change enough and kind of meet each other in the middle for them to finally connect, because they have been missing each other for a while in the films, right? They've been missing each other for most of movie five. They, like, Kokutou doesn't see Shiki until the very end of movie four. He has no direct interactions with Shiki at all that we see in movie six. He talks to her on the phone, but that's off screen. So it's like these characters have been missing each other in the movies for a while. And then now but like, it's not been a thing you've necessarily focused on as much. And now you're like feeling they can't seem to just get that groove. They can't get back together. They can't really occupy that space comfortably anymore. They need to overcome something in order to actually have a long-term life together.
Yeah. I think part of what's structurally interesting about this movie is that you come into it with, there's really only one big like plot mystery left, which is what was going on with those serial murders in part two, at the beginning of this story. And there are some other thematic things you're curious about, and you want to see where Kokutou and Shiki are going to wind up. But the table has been cleared in a lot of ways between parts 5 and 6, And so now we're here, and I think the big thing is what was going on with those serial murders. And given the nature of Kara no Kyoukai, I was fully expecting this might get fairly complicated. And it, again, relative to other stories, it is complicated. Relative to this series, it's a much simpler answer than I think you were expecting. Like, we get the revelation of who this killer is, at least for this second batch of killings, very quickly. And it's the person we saw at the end of movie 6 in the post-credits scene. And we know that person's name, and we see them, and they are a main character in the movie for most of the runtime. Both Shiki and Mikia realize this themselves. We even get a lot of the motive and stuff, because before the hour mark, even Mikia is at that character's apartment, seeing his, like, shrine to Shiki, which is one of the best sets in any of these. Talk about Ufotable doing fucking set design. Oh my God, that's a good one. We'll talk about that. And then there's the tension isn't, can Shiki deal with this situation? Of course Shiki can deal with this situation. And if Shiki can't deal with it, Touko could snap her fingers and deal with this situation, right? Like, this person is not much of a threat. And the real question is actually between Kokutou and Shiki, and that Kokutou lays this down of, if you kill this person, I will never forgive you. And Shiki trying to explain, like, I need to kill this person. I need to kill. There's something in me that wants to do this, blah, blah, blah. You know, I think the big centerpiece turning moment is this phone call they have in the middle of the movie. It's right around the halfway point, and it is... Yeah. And it's so brilliantly staged, because it is the longest conversation these two have had on screen since, like, movie 3. I don't know, like, in a long time, right? But they are not in the same physical space. They are talking on the phone. They are in different places, and it lays down sort of what the actual action of the final act of this story is going to be, which is what choices both of them are going to make vis-a-vis the threat in front of them, and how they resolve that, you know, what that is going to say about them as people. And I think that's what is so clever about this as a structure. It really forces you into the last hour of Kara no Kyoukai is not about any sort of advanced plot mechanics, or even like, what are the powers we're going to need to get to defeat blah, 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 right? None of that. It is really more about, who are these characters going to declare themselves to be through this confrontation? And I think that is what makes it such a, as I said before, tour de force.
Yeah, the movie is extremely contemplative in that way. Like, and it knows, and it sets itself up as like, this is not going to be about having the big craziest fight you have ever seen, because it's like, because Ryo is like clearly not as formidable as like even Fujino was in movie 3. Like, he's nowhere near as frightening. Like, yeah, he can murder normal people and eat them, but he's not like sort of, oh, what the fuck would you ever do if you're fighting this guy? The way like you see Fujino, it's like, oh, any normal person would die immediately. Ryo is like, if you got the drop on that dude with a gun, like, it's over, like, the fight's over, right? Yeah, he's physically, like, very powerful, but he can't twist space with the power of his fucking mind. He's not a ghost lady, like, entering your dreams and make you jump off a rooftop, and he's not a 500-year-old Buddhist priest dude who can, like, control reality and is like, seemingly immortal and all that crazy shit that Soren is. He's, like, nowhere near as, like, intimidating a threat as any of the other villains we have ever had. And so, as you say, it is all about the emotional state of the characters and what this confrontation means for who they are as people, and how are they going to end up changed by this confrontation. And that kind of very slow, thoughtful, contemplative space is an interesting place to be in. And it's something we talked about with the structure overall of the series, with like movie 5 is just designed as this big the big conflict and the resolution and kind of the climax of that core mystery. And everything that happens after that point in 6 and 7 are like the leftovers of what is left after Soren is taken care of. There's like a couple of other people who he gave some of these powers to. And so these are all just like that come down. It's the falling action resolution stage of the plot, effectively. And it's interesting to just get a whole movie that is set in that period of a larger meta plot structure.
Yeah, I mean, you could almost, I think, say that movie 7 is a 2-hour denouement. You know, because the level of like actual plot mechanics to take care of it feels high maybe going in, but it is relatively low when you step back and look at it. I guess I do have one question here, Sean, and I intentionally did not try to like go out and like look this up for myself, because I thought it would be more interesting to have the conversation on the podcast. But I was not just watching the movie, and again, I only have seen it the one time, etc. I have not read any of the books or any of that stuff, but from what I gathered, it's definitely clear that Ryo is the guy who was the killer for this new round of killings. Was he also the person doing all the killings before?
Yes,
okay.
That scene that happens at the end of episode 6, that takes place like during the timeline of movie 2.
Okay.
So that thing he talks about when he punches the guy and it ends up like killing him because the guy falls badly or whatever. That's the first time Ryo ever kills anybody. That happened when he was in high school.
Right.
Because it's after Shiki told him, like, basically, you're pathetic. I forget what her exact words are, but it's like, she's not into weak people, I think is what she says. And he's frustrated by that. He's wandering around the city. He gets into a confrontation with someone and accidentally kills them. And then after that is when Soren encounters him in the alleyway. He is impressed that Ryo's like immediate reaction was to try to eat the body, and realizes that this must mean he sort of realizes, oh, this guy's origin is to devour things. I can activate that, basically turn him into a monster who will keep on repeating this over and over again as a way to try. And he's, Soren is doing this because he is trying to get Shiki's mystic eyes of death perception to awaken, because that happens before they have awakened, right? Same when we get the flashback that shows him resolving the very end of movie 2 and Soren interrupts them. That's because he is trying to get her eyes of death perception to awaken. So all that stuff happened during the high school period.
That's basically what I thought. There is also all this dialogue in here about, the two Shikis, and there was the male Shiki who ultimately, in the the scope of this series, we never knew for that long because they're only there in movie 2. But that person's language being murder, and that being the only thing they knew. And I was kind of on the fence of, are they referring to the whole thing in movie 2 of they knew murder because as a dual personality they were constantly being suppressed, that idea? Or is it saying that that was the personality that did the murders? This is what I thought, but it's that makes sense.
Yeah, because it's one of the things that's meant to create the ambiguity, is the memories that Shiki lost, our Shiki lost, were the memories that the male Shiki had because he died. That's why she lost them. Right. So she doesn't know, technically, who was the killer, because she doesn't know, was it my other personality, or was it somebody else? And so presumably at the end of movie 6, she realizes it was someone else. And so that's one of the reasons why she's investigating the crimes, is because she knows, obviously she knows it's not her, but she also knows it's not another personality of her, that there is another killer out there. And so that's one of the reasons that is happening. And
also that as much as there is all this talk about her being a killer, blah, 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 neither Shiki personality seems to have been inherently violent in that sense. That is Kokutou's argument over and over again that is ultimately borne out here, I think it would be fair to say, in the action we see.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. That his speech at the end of movie 2 of him saying he believes that she couldn't have possibly killed them because her unique relationship with herself, which is one of killing herself. So she knows what it is to kill and she knows what it is to die in a conceptual sense, and she knows the pain of both of those things, means that she is kind. She is a fundamentally kind person because she would not want to inflict that pain on other people, even if she has this impulse or this desire to do that, or and some of the way she feels towards people takes the form of this sort of destructive impulse. She is able to suppress that, and she never gives in. Right, the only people she has killed is Soren, and this movie I think rightly says he doesn't really count. That's basically Ryo just is no, that guy, the weird 500-year-old Buddhist monster dude, because also when Shiki killed him, that arguably isn't even just Shiki. That is the world extinguishing Soren because he's an aberrant entity. He's an anomaly. He shouldn't be allowed to exist, as Shiki says. And so then the first person she really kills is Ryo in this film.
Yeah. Because and I was gonna say, arguably you could make a similar argument about Ryo by the time you get to the end of this movie. But so much of this film is devoted to, Kinoko Nasu's dialogue and the very philosophical musings behind it. And this is something I think I said all the way back in the first episode of this season, Sean, which is that if this writing were 1 degree less good, it might be insufferable, because it is such sort of hoity-toity, philosophical stuff. But it is that good, and so it is that interesting. And so much of this, again, long 2-hour movie is devoted to these discussions of, what is murder? And there's that motif we keep going back to of the thing that Shiki's grandfather told her of, you can only kill one person in your life, truly. And then you have the entire discussion with Touko about the difference between murder and slaughter, and why would a person kill another human being, and what does it do to you to kill? And I think all of that, coming together, why I think it works so well is, one, the writing is just genuinely interesting, and I think Nasu's dialogue style is just so vivid and singular. But I also think the way it ties into the questions about this character and the questions we have coming in, this is such the good version of this, where there's this almost Trojan horse of plot bringing us into this point. But because the plot is resolved relatively early, we realize the actual questions that we had are about who this person is. I'm referring to Shiki here, and what would their capacity to kill be in the first place. And all of the different conversations we have come back to these points about, and this is true of, I think, the discussions of, sexual assault in movie 3, and about suicide in movie 1, and all these other sort of violent ideations that are discussed in these films, that there is something twisted and inhuman to the act of, like, taking another life that is also and equally human. And so that is, and Kokutou has that insight, and that is the thing he sees in Shiki. And Touko has this line where she says, "You would kill another person when the emotion you feel towards another person exceeds your capacity." And that, like, knocked me back in my seat, and I thought that was really interesting. And of course, when does Shiki actually cross that boundary? Kara no Kyoukai, crossing the boundary. And it is the end when she really is holding herself back to the degree that she's willing to let herself die in this, confrontation with Ryo. And what it ultimately is his, bragging that he has murdered Kokutou. That is the thing where we see just how human she really is, because it would be the most human thing in the world to hear that about the person you love and then want to kill them, right? And that is what Touko is kind of saying. And so I think there's so many things. We could spend hours breaking down the different, I think, philosophical arguments this movie makes, but the way it all extends outward from those questions about the characters and their humanity is, I think, what grounds it and makes it so good, in addition to just, again, the quality of the dialogue is electric.
Yeah, that scene you're pointing out about with Touko is one of my favorite pieces of Touko dialogue. It's like the most Touko dialogue in the whole thing, of that, it's her, like, brutally logical way of defining things. That, yes, when she says, when the emotion you feel towards another person exceeds your capacity, be it love or hate, when the emotion overflows, it needs to be eliminated somehow. When the elimination method becomes extreme, it becomes murder. It only becomes murder when one puts each other's dignity and their past on scale and eliminates one or the other. So killing someone means killing yourself. And I'm reading that off of your screenshots. I think you cut a little bit of the lines in the middle, but it's fine, because it's her talking about the difference between that of you killing someone who you recognize as a person, that's murder. Killing Satsu Diku or slaughter is, you killing people and you no longer being human. Your victims are still human. They still have dignity, or they still have their humanity. You have abandoned that with your sort of pointless killing. Means that you kind of like forfeited something about your humanity at that point. That's part of Grandpa Ryogi's whole thing. If you can only really kill someone once, once you have gone past that and you're killing people more than that, it has become slaughter. And then you have the Satsujinki, or the bloodthirsty killer. I think they translated it as Satsujinki is literally like Satsu is kill, Jin is person, Ki is demon. The same key as like Kimetsu no Yaiba. So the Japanese word there, and they make a kind of a pun on it where she says, like, it literally, from her perspective, a Satsujinki is literally someone who is like a demon. So they have like abandoned their humanity completely, and they're like I think she equates them to a natural disaster.
Yes.
And anyone who gets killed by someone like that, who is like given up to so much needless slaughter, like, you're just unlucky, like, you're unfortunate, because there's nothing about you as a person that has caused that death to happen to you. You just, like, there happened to be an earthquake that day and you happen to be one of the people killed, is basically what it's like if you're passing the path of a true quote-unquote Satsujinki or bloodthirsty killer.
Yeah, I think it would be safe to say, other than, like, and I made this comparison, I think, in episode 1, other than maybe Brian Fuller's Hannibal, the NBC series, I can't say I've ever seen a piece of serial fiction, certainly serial fiction that is about, like, serial killers or crime or any of this, that gets this deep into the actual, like, messy, interesting, moral, philosophical questions of, like, what is killing in the first place? Like, what is the actual act we're talking about beyond just the extinguishing of life? And even in that, there's, like, interesting questions there. That's something I think Hannibal would do. It is probably a comparable work in terms of, like, taking the high, almost ridiculous philosophy and making it interesting. And that goes in almost a more camp direction with it. But I think there's a comparison here in terms of, like, really bringing those ideas to extremities and exploring them in such fascinating fashion.
Yeah, and I think just Toko's way of defining that, like, the reason why one person would kill another person, like, the fundamental thing is that your emotions towards that person exceeds your capacity to be able to deal with that emotion, and that you must do something to deal with that overflow effectively, and one of those options is murder, right? There's, like, lots of other things that one could do, and that kind of is, I think, part of that concept is a key theme for the whole film, because now after she says that, you're then looking at all these other interactions that are happening and the way that the word kill is being used and filtering it through that idea of this is because a person is feeling such intense emotion towards someone or something that, like, the vocabulary, the language, or the tool that they are trying to use to deal with that excessive emotion that they cannot deal with is to eliminate that thing that is causing that emotion. And that's, like, Shiki's whole thing that she has been saying multiple times throughout the series is when she likes somebody, she describes it as, like, I'm feeling a murderous impulse towards you. You know, that's like the end of movie 3 where she says that to Kokutou and gives this, like, uncharacteristically kind of like carefree smile to the camera. It's like the last line of that film. And she says it again. Or I think Mikia tells Azaka at the end of movie 6 when they're on the way to the cafe or whatever that Shiki told that to him. That's like she was feeling like a little bit of a murderous impulse towards Azaka, so that must mean she likes you. And it's like part of the aberrant nature of Shiki is that because of the nature of her existence, murder is like an option to her. It's like part of her vocabulary. It's like it's the fundamental of the way that she perceives and feels things. Whereas for most people, that door is closed. Like, killing someone is not like an acceptable means of dealing with the excessive emotion that you're feeling towards someone, and so it will take some other form. But for Shiki, that's not an option to, or like she has to struggle against this desire to kill because it's a thing that she knows. It's a thing that she conceptually and philosophically understands and feels. And I think, like, all of that push and pull throughout not just this movie, but now you can, like, reflect on the other films and see how that has been a consistent idea through her characterization throughout the whole thing.
Well, that's what I wanted to say here. That's what I wanted to add, is that all of these discussions so clearly are built on the backs of what we've been seeing so far, and then shine back on those discussions as well. You know, when you have that line from Touko about, you know, you kill when, you know, your emotion has towards someone has reached its capacity. One thing I think about is movie 3 and the, you know, incredible visual metaphor of someone being sexually assaulted and then twisting the perpetrator into the inhuman shape that they are. That's the kind of thing that Touko is talking about there, right? But then I'm also thinking about in episode 3, like with the difference between slaughter and murder, the scene where Shiki comes in and says, that's not a human, that's a pile of meat, right? Like, that moment is like, okay, yes, that connects to this. And there's just all sorts of moments throughout all of these. Like, I think this movie, I don't know if it ever even uses the word suicide, but I think so much of this is about suicide as a form of murder too. And of course, that was movie 1. And I think there's a very clear reason why chapter 1 is on that theme of suicide and chapter 7 is on that theme of murder and what choices Shiki will make. And you know, I think the implication and where we kind of take it is that male Shiki did commit suicide. It wasn't a car came out of the blue and hit him. He walked out into traffic and, like, literally let the body go, you know, falling backwards. And that is what happened because he loved Kokutou. Like, there is this, like, I think there's a very beautiful moment there where it wasn't shame from being a murderer. It was not knowing how else to live in the world with him. And, you know, again, those interesting conversations about gender. But it's the best kind of ending in that sense because it brings all of these themes and stories we've been seeing together and I think uses them to build new ideas and then uses those ideas to shine back in a way that if you were to restart the cycle and start at movie 1 again, you'd be seeing everything in a slightly different light.
Yeah, I mean, with the suicide thing, I definitely think that that's an intentional piece of what they're saying here with murder. Because that's part of the nuance of Grandpa Rogi's message is, like, you can only truly kill one person in your life, and that's either you kill yourself, right? That might be the one person you kill. And then obviously at that point, you're physically incapable of killing anyone else, or you kill someone else, and then, like, at that point, like, you have abandoned your dignity as a person. And so if you go on to kill other people, you're not murdering them. It has become slaughter. It's become something else because you have moved past this point of that being like an option that you have now given yourself versus it was an option you never had before because it's the first time you did it. But yeah, I think you are 100% meant to read that Shiki's choice, male Shiki's choice, of falling into traffic as I'm going to end myself because I cannot kill Kokutou. And I think it also, another thing in all that stuff that I think it recolors is something I don't think I noticed originally. But it jumped out to me because there's dialogue that kind of re-examines the moment at the end of movie 2 where Shiki has Kokutou pinned to the ground and asks him, like, what should we do or whatever? And he says, like, I don't want to die. And she says, well, the thing is that I want to kill you. And that moment, it's not male Shiki, it is female Shiki. She says watashi. So
yes,
it's like,
I noticed that
is
too.
Like the personality that is not meant to kill. And I think that that's a thing you're not necessarily meant to key in on as much the first time you see it, because it's once you go back to that moment and you've had some of this dialogue, and you get some of the stuff with Shiki is worried because she's worried that's like, I'm the one that wants to kill you. It wasn't the other one. It's me that feels that impulse. And so you get that moment where it's like, it's part of what has kind of like thrown her entire life into chaos is that she doesn't know, like neither of her personalities knows what to do when confronted with this new feeling of love towards another person, which is in this case is Kokutou. And so for both of them, it takes some sort of like murderous inflection. For both of them, they lash out against Kokutou because they don't know how to deal with the feeling. And male Shiki's choice is, I need to like eliminate myself. I need to like eliminate that part of the equation in an attempt to let Kokutou live. And I think like all of that recoloring those scenes from movie 2 is really powerful.
This is not a love triangle, but there are 3 people in this romance. There are 2 Shikis and there is Kokutou, yes. Right? And all 3 of them, over the course of this story, make a sacrifice. You have the literal suicide of male Shiki. You have female Shiki, or I guess whatever we would call the like fully like put together Shiki of the second half of the story, the one we know, who uses male pronouns but has a female body. Multiple times letting herself die, basically, against Ryo to fulfill what Kokutou wanted. And Kokutou, of course, refusing to cross the boundary that Ryo keeps offering him through the drugs and through the death, and ultimately seemingly getting killed. He takes a very good stabbing to the eye, and it seems like he is very dead. But again, he has a thick skull there, lost an eye but lived, which, you know, there are worse prices he could pay. He'll be okay. And
hey, he looks pretty fucking badass at the end of the movie with his like longer hairstyle and the like classic scar over the one eye. Like if he wants to go, you know, like be a bounty hunter or something, like he's got it all made out already.
I love the idea of Kokutou in the hospital and them saying, all right, well, we could give you an eye patch for the eye that you're missing. And he's like, no, could you help me style my hair so half of it is just over that? I've always wanted that look. It looks really cool. And now that I don't even see out of that eye, it's not even an inconvenience.
Yeah, and I just want, like, sometimes when I'm having, like, an intense conversation with somebody on a windy night in the city, and, like, the wind just happens to blow my hair, and they get a glimpse of the fucking eye scar underneath it. It's like, I can really play off this whole new look.
It's great. But back to my point, everybody commits a suicide, basically, in this relationship, or an act of self-sacrifice before the ultimate reunion, in a way that I don't know if you thought this at all, Sean, but I definitely was catching shades of Romeo and Juliet in the final act of this movie. Mm-hmm. Like, I think there is, because I didn't know how it was going to end. So I was definitely like, well, where is this going? And when Kokutou seemingly dies, and then Shiki does kill Leo, but in a way that seems like maybe she is also on the ground, bleeding out, dying, you know. I was worried, is this going to be like, they've both self-sacrificed, but then Kokutou's going to wake up a la Juliet, and she's going to come in and see, you know, Shiki a la Romeo on the ground dead, and then is Kokutou going to have to either live with that, or is he going to kill himself? And of course, they don't go to that level of melodrama, but this does play out a little bit like Romeo and Juliet if they had magical powers and were more self-aware adults instead of stupid teenagers, is like one way I would describe it. And I think it's an interesting use of like the tragic structure towards a happy ending. Yeah,
because I do think it is intentionally, it has a very tragic structure that ends in Shakespearean terms in comic fashion. It ends with, they don't literally, or they're not married at the end of the movie, but they are symbolically wedded, right? They walk away hand in hand, and Shiki has her speech we'll get to at the end and everything. But yes, I think it is meant to have this tragic structure of these two people trying to connect. They're supposed to be able to connect. They need to be able to connect, but for various reasons, they just can't. Some of those reasons practical, but those practical reasons really being an extension of a thematic reason, of a personal reason, of like there's something about them that they need to be able to overcome. I think the most powerful scene that represents that is the scene at the midpoint of the movie where they talk to each other on the phone. And this is like one of my favorite stagings of a scene I think I've ever seen in a movie, just because it's so poetic in how it gets the point across that they are talking to each other on the phone, but each of them is in the other person's apartment.
Yes.
Right? So Mikia goes to Shiki's apartment because he's worried about Shiki and trying to find her, uses her key that he got in movie 5 to open the door and go in. And then the phone rings. He hesitates for a long while, then picks up the phone and says, "Mushi Mushi, who's there?" And then it's Shiki, and then we cut to Shiki and see that she is in Mikia's apartment that we've seen a couple of times. We saw it a little bit in movie 6 also, I think, to kind of like reset up its location. We saw it in this movie with his detective uncle or whoever the fuck that, I did forget what his relationship is to Mikia, but the detective guy who comes over. And so we know it's his apartment, and she has let herself into his apartment because she got his key at the end of movie 5 also. We see that key because she pockets it later. And so she went to Mikia's apartment because she was worried about him, trying to find him because they've both been separately investigating, calls her an apartment to try to find him. And so it's like these two people standing in each other's apartments that they both let themselves into, talking to each other on the phone rather than being in the same place. And it's both of their apartments, it's at night, the lights aren't on in either. And it's such a powerful kind of theatrical staging. Like you can almost imagine it on like in a play, like on a stage where you would have two separate kind of rooms set up on the physical stage and having those characters be in those two spaces facing the opposite way effectively. It is really powerful, I think, conceptually to represent these two people so desperately wanting and needing to connect because they care so much about the other person. But it's almost like how much they care about the other person is almost exactly the thing that is keeping them from being able to connect, because they're both destroying themselves in order to protect the other person, right? The reason why Shiki's trying to kill Ryo fundamentally is because she wants her life with Kokutou. She wants to have that normalcy back, and she feels she can't have it unless she eliminates Ryo. He's a threat to that normal life. And then Kokutou doesn't want Shiki to kill Ryo, but the thing that he doesn't articulate in that scene, but he is able to articulate to himself in a monologue at the end of the movie, is that the reason for that isn't really because he gives a shit about Ryo. Like, obviously, if he could find a way to save him, he would. Kokutou's still that guy. But fundamentally, the reason why he doesn't want Shiki to kill Ryo isn't because he's trying to protect Ryo. He's trying to protect Shiki. He doesn't want her to cross that line because he thinks it will hurt her more than anything. And that's why he tells her, like, if you do this, I will never forgive you. He's not doing it because he wouldn't forgive her. That's obviously not true. Or we feel that's obviously not true. Shiki, I think, doesn't see that. He's using that because it's the harshest thing he can think to say to try to get her not to do it. But it's not because he cares about Ryo. It's because he cares about her. But neither person is able to express that to the other.
And all of it is such a profound visual and, in terms of staging and mise-en-scène, articulation of the idea of boundaries and lines that is, of course, the center of this series from the title on down. Shiki's first half of the conversation over the phone, she's explaining, I still yearn for murder even after, Shiki-kun died. He's the only one, he could only think in terms of murder, blah, blah, blah. And she ends saying, I can't return to the other side, right? And just in that moment, because of the staging of it, it's bullshit because she's in his apartment. Yeah. She's there, able to say those words in the space she is in because she's returned to the other side, because she never really was outside of that space to begin with, right? And that is a fundamental, and in fact, Kokutou's next line is, that's your misunderstanding, Shiki, right? And it is wrong, and they're both wrong in some sense. And of course, this whole movie is a journey from this false sort of boundary they've erected between each other to the final scene of the movie being them on the ground embracing. And I think the absolutely just titanically beautiful sentiment that Kokutou offers in that moment of, I will bear this sin with you. Of course, I will forgive you. I don't even need to forgive you. I will be here to do that with you. And that's the value of an actual, like, adult relationship, right? Is, like, living with someone and being able to bear those pains together. And that is the thing that Kokutou maybe was his mistake of the boundary he thought he was in of, oh, if she crosses over, there's nothing I can do for her. Well, that's bullshit. That's him discounting the power of his own love and affection and humanity, that if she does, he can still be there to catch her and vice versa.
Yeah. It's such a powerful scene. A part of that is it also comes from, like, it inverts a lot of, like, the meaning we had for movie 5 with the keys and that repeated usage of the key of, like, defining the boundaries between the inside and the outside and the family life and the life beyond. And there's something about them both using the keys that they got from the other person to try to access that inside life, that interior, that, like, family. And then both trying to do it at the same time, and that causing them to be in the opposite place, right? That they are, like, they access in some way that inside life, but because the other person isn't there with them, it's, like, cold and alien and distant and dark. That's part of that staging as well, that I think, you know, that makes movie 7 so powerful, is that it is just taking all the little things we had built up all along the rest of the series, and it is using it to its maximum effectiveness. Another thing we get here, as I'm looking through some of your screenshots of the dialogue in that scene, is I like in the kind of one of the opening lines in that scene is Shiki saying to Kokutou, I'm fed up with your generalizations, where Kokutou's just saying, like, you, because he opens his gambit, his opening gambit is like, you can't kill him because killing is wrong. And he just kind of says that repeatedly. And I like that Shiki kind of shuts that down. So it's like, I'm tired of, like, these, like, generalizations, like these patent, like, sort of, like, you know, little truths that you sort of hold that have no nuance, right? And you're just sort of saying that over and over and over again. And it's one of, like, the ways of his sort of, like, normalness, his appeal to some kind of, like, fundamental goodness. That's like, well, that's nice, but it doesn't always apply. Like, it doesn't always work. I'm, like, tired of that shit. And she's right to call him out on it because it is bullshit. And, like, and I think we know that Miyuki knows it's bullshit because we've seen him be more nuanced in other moments in the series. But it's when he doesn't know what else to say, he falls back on this sort of truism of, like, it's just wrong to kill, when we know that that's, like, not necessarily true, or that that's not the whole story here. And I like that both characters are able to call each other on their bullshit, but they're still not able to fully get through to the other person yet.
Right, and I think, you know, part of the strategy here in this movie is making Ryo, like, the most monstrous figure, I think, in the whole series. I think it would be fair to say. Like, there's a lot of time spent developing, like, this person is a piece of fucking shit. And what they have become by the final act of this movie, like, I think the most disturbing thing in all 7 of these movies is him literally drooling over Shiki's body in the scene where he has her, like, bound, and he is, like, biting at her flesh, and he is, like, leaving all this... It's genuinely hard for me to watch. It's, like, verging into the kind of body horror that I don't fuck with and I don't like. It's, you know, verging on the cannibalistic. And, you know, so this figure, like... And, of course, the point of that scene is even someone this monstrous who so clearly, like, if anyone deserves to be killed, he deserves to be killed. If there is a Christian God, you know, or a Judeo-Christian God, and you decided to cap this person, he'd go, yeah, I'll look the other way on that commandment on that one. He fucking had it coming. This person, like, the world's better without them, right? But, like, it matters that is the person we go into extremis in terms of these discussions with, because it both lays bare some of the childishness of what Kokutou is talking about, but then through that childishness gets us to the actual meat of the conversation, which isn't what is the stark gray, or, you know, black and white, non-shades of gray morality of killing. what he's actually interested in, what we're all actually interested in here is what does it do to the soul of the person in this moment, right? It's what he's finally able to admit to himself in that last moment, when he has been nearly killed and he's climbing up the stairs, or really crawling because he can't use one of his legs. And it's this, he says, I don't want you to kill him because I want you to be happy, because I don't want you to be hurt any more than you already have, because I love you. And I think that's the moment where, like, the waterworks started going a little bit for me, I will admit. The room got a little dusty because that is like, you finally pushed through it and we've gotten to the actual truth of this thing.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, that scene is very powerful. Yes, and you are not the only one who gets misty-eyed at this, like, because I think the movie builds up to it so powerfully. You just, like, again, you desperately want to see these two people come together. And sometimes it's more satisfying to see that, like, fulfillment rather than having the tragic conclusion of ripping that out from under you at the last moment in a Romeo and Juliet fashion. In the sense, like, no, sometimes you do just want to see the fulfillment of these two people. It's just that, like, that fulfillment it by necessity, it is a messy thing. It is not a clean thing. It's part of the point of the movie.
But it's earned. It's, like, so earned. It is not a tragic story where then the author gets cold feet and pulls out at the last minute, which we've all seen plenty of examples of that. This is, I think, using a tragic structure to get to these truths, because these people are not going to admit to themselves what they need to admit until they have gone through this particular ringer, I think is, like, how it feels to me. And so that moment of coming together feels... Just the simple act, the climax of this entire crazy series that has dealt with some of the most metaphysically lunatic things you'll ever see. And, we have learned about the root and the origin and all this other stuff and the mystic eyes and all of that. What is the ultimate, like, climax of this thing? It is two people hugging. It is two people, like, pulling their bodies, that being the actual final boundary that they have to cross, is letting each other into, each other person into their life. And that being an act of extreme bravery that requires self-understanding, And it all goes back to, I flagged this in the season premiere of Japanimation Station, that I think Ufotable was very wise to open their adaptation with the scene of Shiki coming in of Kokutou coming into Shiki's apartment, trying to kind of get across to her with the strawberry ice cream, and setting up that as kind of our opening motif, because, yes, that is what the whole series is about. It is ultimately about trying to close that distance with ice cream, with murder, whatever you want, and that is where we end. And, this episode even opens with a callback to that scene of him coming back to the apartment and bringing flowers.
Yes.
But it is one of, like, my favorite structural touches of this series, is where we start, where we end, is such a perfect overall motion that they have done in this anime adaptation.
Yes, yeah, I was very excited. That was like kind of like when you pointed out Kokutou's characterization. That was another moment. I was like secretly like, oh my god, yes! Like it was such like a good thing you picked up on. I was like, awesome, yes, because I know you're 100% right, but I'm honestly not going to like to go on about it for like 30 minutes.
Like, oh, thank God, Jonathan gets it. He's not telling us like this is going to be a series about people eating ice cream. They're like, oh, this is going to be a rough season.
Yes,
it's going to be a rough season of Japanimation Station. He doesn't get it.
Yeah, well, I think it was one of the moments where I realized, like, oh, this is going to work really well because you're, like, vibing on in the way that, like, the series wants you to vibe on. That, like, you can pick up on that very quickly, I think is important, because I think it's, like, how the series wants to be read. It's, like, opening itself up to, they start there very intentionally, and it's very important that it is about their relationship. It's about trying to overcome this gap in understanding between these two people.
It's so structurally smart. It's just this whole fucking project. And I am sure this is equally true of the book, anime, because the anime is a fairly close, certainly on the macro level, is an exact adaptation of the pieces. And, like, I have seen this kind of thing done badly or overly simplistically so many times, but, like, the idea of it really does boggle my mind as someone who has, taken a crack at writing stories in the past and spends a lot of time analyzing stories, certainly, to see someone write a story like this that is presented all out of order, even when it's technically moving in chronological order, like in episodes 5, 6, and 7, is still presenting things in a fashion that is, like, kind of confusing and misplaced, and, you are you don't start at the beginning, but when you do get to the beginning, you set up these mysteries that you're not going to resolve until the complete other side of it, but you have to know every piece of that along the way. There's a level of like authorial confidence in that to know your story so well, and then know how to move the pieces around to tell that story in the best possible way. You know, there's not many works of art I can point to that or visual art at least, that really, really do that so fucking well. You know, in movies, the probably principal example ever is like Citizen Kane or something, right? And that's one film. You're doing this over hundreds of pages and 7 movies. You know, people still like to use Inception as shorthand for a complicated movie. They don't know what they're talking about. That is an exception. That's not me shitting on Inception, by the way. Inception is an exceptionally straightforward movie that you can learn 3-act structure from very well. It's actually not a complicated film. And I'm not even sure the movie thinks it's that complicated, but people have taken it that way. This is the actual example of what I think people are like thinking about, of where you have really cracked open a plot and made an amazing story out of arranging the pieces for maximal effectiveness.
Yeah, and I think it's why it's like was so critical for the adaptation to preserve that structure, because you see how much impact it has in this movie. It's like, this is the movie that I think like lays bare the power of that structure, because it's like, oh, now you've got all the pieces put together, and this movie is now playing with the whole puzzle piece, or the whole puzzle picture, right? And it's like, it like, I think there's almost a joy in the movie of being able to put, okay, now we can kind of juxtapose scenes or ideas and themes across the various different movies we've done, and put them all together and juxtapose them directly with each other, like in images like the locks and the keys and stuff, and going back and filling in some of the flashbacks from movie 2. I was able to put all of that in and bring in some like the suicide ideas from the first movie, and the like emotion, like the idea of emotion overflowing that Touko has is a clear callback to movie 3, which is all about this girl hitting this emotional breaking point where her whole like life explodes almost literally with her powers, because it has, you know, her insensitivity to things has been like overcharged or whatever. It is like past the point that she can withstand it anymore. All of those things are put together here finally in this last film for you to be able to fully kind of appreciate and sink into the story. And it would not be anywhere near as satisfying if it had been presented in a strictly linear fashion, one after the other, because you have engaged with the whole structure on that level. You've been engaging with it on a thematic, idea-based level, not on a strictly plot-based level like you would if it was just told in normal chronological fashion, the way that it's very easy to imagine a different anime studio wanting to do with this property. Like, it's very easy to imagine why, if you're Kinoko Nasu or Takashi Takeuchi from Type Moon, you would be nervous about the idea of someone adapting Kata no Kyoukai, because I think your immediate assumption would be, oh, they're going to make it chronological. They're going to say, this is too confusing. We're going to break all that up. We're going to tone down the like sort of extreme content, put it in chronological order, and why you need a studio like a UFO table that's going to respect the sort of ideas of the source material to the point that they understand it is essential that it is told in this order, because that is what the story is fundamentally about.
We've seen an example of this on this show very recently, Sean, because season 1 of Japanimation Station was us talking about Full Metal Alchemist, a work that is not nearly as structurally adventurous as Kara no Kyoukai, but in manga form is built on delaying reader understanding of certain things until you hit a flashback point, and both major anime adaptations of that story can't run away from that structure fast enough. They are like allergic to the non-chronological setting of it, and again, that's a pretty simple use of this kind of thing. So yeah, I can totally imagine why Nasu and company would be wary, because there's plenty of examples. Even fucking I always forget this when I go back to the One Piece anime. The One Piece anime fucking rearranges the beginning of the manga for absolutely inexplicable reasons. It's just like, this is a constant thing that happens where like the author did it in a certain way that makes sense, and then it's like, how do we flatten this out? And Ufotable did no flattening. They fully committed to the project.
Yes, and it's really essential that they did. So let's pick out some other sequences of this movie. One thing I want to talk about is I want to talk a little bit more about Touko, because we've talked some about her like big dialogue stuff, but there's a lot of emotional stuff at the end of this movie Weirdly, I think the thing in this movie that makes me the most emotional is partially just I love Touko so much as a character. She's the character from Kono no Kyoukai that pops up in the most other stuff. We're not going to see her much elsewhere in this run of stuff. We'll get a brief glimpse. I hope that when we get her, I hope you spot whenever Touko is going to pop up, because she's important one other time in something else we're going to watch, but it's very brief. But she's in a lot of the kind of expanded stuff because she's a very popular character. She's obviously in Mahou Tsukai no Yoru is the main thing she's in. But I really love Touko. And there's something about her last scene in this movie, which is her. She has had her big scene. She's told all the stuff to Mikia. It's our big last logic lecture from Touko. And she gives it to Mikia, and Mikia runs out and leaves. And normally you would then cut to Mikia immediately as he leaves the Hollow Shrine, the place that they work at, and goes out to go find Shiki. But instead, the camera lingers in the office, and it stays on Touko, and she takes out a cigarette, and she smokes a cigarette, and we're just hanging out with her. And then Azaka comes running in, and she's looking for Mikia, and is, saying all the shit about Shiki and all this stuff, and going on and on about it. And then she says this line about, oh, he should just cut ties with that damn woman already. And Touko says quietly to herself, cut ties, huh? It probably has been a little too long that I've stuck around, but it's just I've grown maybe a bit too affectionate of all you guys. And she kind of says it quietly to herself, and Azaka says, oh, what's up? As soon as she says, nothing or whatever, I think she's going to, give her some more training or something. And that's the last time we see Touko, with the strong implication being, and this is, effectively what happens. I don't think it ever says this, but this is obviously what happens, is she leaves town. Right, that she has stayed in one place for too long. She's been here for a couple of years, but she, by her nature, she is a mage, right? And she has to go pick up things and go start somewhere else again. And there's something about that quiet little moment with her where she feels she's kind of sees that, maybe everything is going to go to shit and these people are going to die. That is still a possibility at this point, but I think she has faith that Miki and Shiki are going to find a way to get through this. And I think she sees that it's I've done what I can for them, and it's time for me to move on. And it's your classic, Wild West or Zatoichi, the wandering hero who has come into town. I don't think you ever realize that's a whole dynamic that is part of the story, but she has wandered into town. She has done the things she needs to do to fix the problems that she's found there, but she can't live in that world. She has to pick up and go off to the next place. And part of this connects to some of, the story in Mahou Tsukai no Yoru, if you know where she came from as a character, which is very different to the older version of you see her here, that there's something very powerful to me about the idea that it's time for her to pick up and move on. And that scene always has hit me really hard both times I've watched this movie.
I definitely responded. I love that scene. I think it's a really striking moment, especially it's another one that benefits from just the movie being slow and lingering on scenes, I think any scene with Touko where you're able to just sit back and let her drag a cigarette and talk obviously is going to be good. I think it would hit me even harder if I had seen the movie before and knew, oh, that's her last scene. That's the end of this character in this work. And it is, of course, a perfect ending for all the reasons you're saying here.
Yeah, it's just that there's something about, I was talking about movie 6, I said, you don't realize how much this world and these people feel oh, this is one of my favorite, the cast of one of my favorite TV shows, that you get that level of affection for them. And that's one of those moments with Touko where it's oh, this is her going off. This is her last scene, in the finale of, the series finale of your favorite TV show. And this is the fan favorite character who's, the supporting character that everyone really loves because they're secretly the most interesting one. And they get that last little juicy scene before the lights go out or whatever. And that's what Touko gets in that moment. You're and there's such a sense of finality there. And that's what happens then you leads into the last fight with Shiki and the big 40-minute finale at the warehouse and all that stuff. That's to me the thing that sets the tone for that moment is Touko signaling this is the end of this story because it's time for me to move on.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. A scene I want to talk about a little bit more is when Mikia goes to Ryo's apartment and sees the shrine to Shiki with all the photos and everything and reads the diary. First off, there's a really striking shot. One of the most maybe the most prominent 3D shot in this movie is they do this spinning camera shot around Kokutou as he reads the diary that is very impressive. It's, I think, one of the only major 3D shots in this series that isn't for kind of an action or set piece kind of thing. I especially love they do this like warping on his glasses to really sell the effect of a camera moving. That's very impressive because, of course, this is when we're getting an eye into the madness of this person and putting all the pieces together. So I think it emphasizes the importance of the exposition here. But what I really love about this entire scene, and there's a whole confrontation between the characters here as well, but is the setup of the room. It is such an interesting space they've made. You have a TV, and then he also has a projector, and there is eventually a shot of the projector throwing light and an image of Shiki on a wall full of images of Shiki, and then there's a big window shining in this kind of orange, like sunset, kind of dusk light into the room, and you have Mikia standing in the line of the projector kind of thinking about it all, and I just have a shot of it here in my screenshots, and it's such an amazing image, but you get lots and lots of those, and particularly how they use that sort of one window in the space and the orange light that is coming in. Oh my god, it's a gorgeous scene, and a obviously deeply haunting one because what's in there is very fucked up, but again, Ufotable very good at setting the scene and using mise-en-scène.
Yeah, that whole sequence is visually incredibly stunning. And one thing that's fun is that is the opening credits of the movie are in that room before you have the context for it, but it's all like the strips of film hanging in that room. And you see that it's like the negatives and it's images of Shiki in negative, which is very powerful, I think, because it's like you think of like the black and white imagery and like the snow and the blood and like that kind of stuff. That's like a lot of the imagery you got in movie 2. Particularly like near the end of movie 2, and I think it's playing on some of that, those colors. And then also it's just one of those shots, as soon as I saw like the opening credits with like film strips hanging and it's like voyeuristic shots of Shiki, I'm like, oh yes, this is all the film people are, they're getting hard-ons watching this scene because this is what you're all into. It's like, it's voyeurism and it's like metatextual because it's like filming pieces of film hanging and developing and negatives and all that shit. I'm like, yes, this is it. This is what you show to your film studies class.
Oh yeah, I was rock fucking hard through this entire opening credits. It's amazing. No, but I do have a block of notes on it because it is like it's it feels like a not quite like a James Bond opening credits sequence, but like a spy movie opening credits sequence. Like you could see this at the front of like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy or something like that, right? And it does, because this is like the most like we get a full opening credits sequence instead of like the credits running over sort of interesting abstract images or something in some of the other scenes, or just over black with like cuts to action. This one gets like a full proper, like you could layer a slow J-rock ballad and make it the Kara no Kyoukai theme song if you want,
Yeah, no, it is a very like sumptuous opening sequence because you're not entirely sure what it is. And I think there is something to this idea of like Ryo being this person who has been watching Shiki the whole time. That I think there's like a certain like audience surrogate position that he is put in, right? Of this like desire for Shiki to be more violent, for her to be the killer or to kill people, that I think is like there as well, that it's kind of playing out of, is that I think there's this, I think there's this desire in any viewer or any audience member for a like violent work of fiction like this, or something that's playing and like thematizing violence so much, and particularly something that is not indulging in it for the main characters, right? So it's not a slasher horror movie, or it's not like some crazy 80s action film where the main character kills fucking 50 people. It's not John Wick, he's just like shooting people in the face left and right. It's like killing someone is a line that this show does not like to cross. It toys with and it plays with. And I think there's a natural desire for that violence to exceed that point and to cross that boundary, right? To go beyond that. And that this series teases with that line, like with probably the most clearly movie 3, right? Where you have this big final encounter between Asagami or Fujino and Shiki, and it ends in this, what is like technically an anticlimax in a violent sense, where neither of them kills the other. Instead, Shiki cures Fujino of what's killing her and walks away. And I think that there's this desire of like, no, there needs to be more blood. There needs to be more death. Like, you need to be this person who is the person who kills, because that's what's satisfying. That's what like plays to that part of the audience. and that Rio, in a meta sense, if you want to read those things in there, I think he's kind of put into that position as well. And he's like jealous that not only does Shiki not like cross that line, I think he's like envious that she won't go to that place, but he's also envious that he doesn't get to be in that world with them. That no matter what he does and how much violence he indulges in, he can never be as sort of like romantic and heroic and interesting and compelling and strong a figure as what Shiki actually is. No matter how much he tries to sort of enact the things that he sees on the outside of her, he can never even approach the life that she has or the life that he imagines she has.
Oh yeah, we could spend a whole lot more time reading this through the lens of sort of voyeurism and violence, and you could definitely, I think, compare this to various sort of English horror works like Halloween, which we recently did a podcast about on the Weekly Stuff, or really the one for me that always comes back to like this is Peeping Tom, which is the Powell and Pressburger movie from the UK, where you have the cameraman literally killing people with the tripod, and there's definitely some images that remind me of that. And I could imagine a version of this movie where Ufotable just don't change the story, just emphasized those ideas more. I think it's not the like thread that they are most emphasizing in this movie, and I think wisely, but it is definitely there and you're thinking about it, and it is very interesting.
Yeah. The other thing I really like in those scenes, because it happens here and then it happens in his conversation with Kokutou at the end of the movie, is Rio. There's something about like his relationship with Kokutou that I love, where he like totally misunderstands Kokutou's kindness, and because he repeatedly says this thing of like, oh, you're always on my side, you're always on Shirafumi Ryo's side, and it's like he totally doesn't get Kokutou's on everybody's side.
Yes.
Because we've been with Kokutou, we've seen him in all these adventures, like, oh, he's on Fujino's side, and he's on like the side of like the women who were committing suicide in the first movie, and he's on Shiki's side, and it's like, he's on Tomoe Enjo's side. Like, he's always on that person's side. He's on Azaka's side. Like, if there is a side that he can take that will help somebody, he's going to be standing on that side. Obviously, the side he cares most about is Shiki's. But, like, if he can afford it, yeah, he's going to help you out. And there's something about Shirafumi Ryo totally misreading that and misunderstanding and, like, thinking, oh, there's something special about me. Maybe he sees in me what he sees in Shiki. I know you have in your screenshots, there's the big kiss that he has where he feeds Kokutou the super marijuana or whatever that's supposed to kill him. And like, I think there's a lot of that, of also his jealousy of Shiki and all of that. There's a dimension of it which is also reflected through his weird perceived relationship with Kokutou that doesn't really exist.
Yeah, I had to take a screenshot of that moment because of course it is. It looks like a particularly aggressive gay kiss if you're looking at it out of context. In context, it's horrifying for completely other reasons than it being two men. But no, like, this is a person who is narcissistic, and that is what voyeurism is, right? Voyeurism comes from the like the idea of narcissism as an actual idea in like psychotherapy. And this is a person who has been so twisted by narcissism, their body transformed by it practically, that they just cannot understand the world in terms outside of their own fucking damage and wants and desires. And that is very much what you see in all of that. He is, he thinks if he fucking, puts the trigger at Kokutou's head, which is through the drugs and the things he's putting in his system, like, of course he's going to come to my side because he wants to preserve his life the way I want to, and he can't understand Kokutou's actual perspective on this at all.
Yeah, and I think there's something powerful in that moment from Kokutou's perspective, that, like, he is ready to face death in this moment, right? Where this is partially that, it's juxtaposed directly in this movie with the scene from movie 2 because they've flashed back to it. But in that scene, he says, I don't want to die. And at this point, I don't think he wants to die, but he's willing to die, or he's prepared to die for what he believes is right. And I think that it's a nice moment where you get to see very directly his growth and how much kind of stronger of a person he has become. Of how willing he is to see through his ideals and what he believes is correct, and that he steadfastly refuses to cross the line and join Rio or even like toy with that idea. He just refuses it outright, to the extent where like Rio is baffled by the very concept It's like, you're not even considering it. Like, as soon as he hands him the drug tablet, Kokutou just immediately throws it away, even though he can barely move at that point.
Yeah. I mean, he doesn't throw it away. He crawls away from it painstakingly.
Yeah.
It hurts him to do it, but like it shows his resolve to Rio in that moment, and it's what baffles him. But I do, one thing I would criticize, or maybe I'm not sure my thoughts on in this movie, is the crazy drug stuff, which we should probably talk about. Like, you have the character dealing, it's the most convoluted part of the plot here, where he is dealing drugs, he's dealing this super marijuana, and he is dealing this super LSD, and if combined, they will make the person go insane and become a killer like him. Is that like his general thought process, basically?
That's what he's trying to do, right? But it's not working.
It's not working.
So he's killing and eating the people that it doesn't work on. And also part of this is like, this is all stuff that Soren has left him.
Right.
So it's like, they're not just drugs, they are like literally magic drugs, right? Like, it is a magical type of marijuana that your body cannot process, is part of what he's selling, so that like it retains in your body. So the more you use it, the more like perpetually high you become, because your body can't get rid of the chemicals. And so eventually that is like the thing that is meant to drive these people insane, but none of it is able to turn them into a monster like Rio is, because of course he is the way he is because of like his origin and all the crazy shit that's happened to him in that metaphysical sense. So it's like, whatever drugs you give somebody else, it's not going to just magically turn them into this bloodthirsty killer or whatever he wants them to be.
Yeah. But like, I don't know. I felt a little uncomfortable with the like big set piece in like a marijuana factory and like their evil drugs. Like, I know it's not literally like marijuana, it's not literally like a reefer madness thing, but it just felt a little bit like we're supposed to be scared of it because it's marijuana, and it feels like in my 2022 America context a little like off and like funny to me. I don't know. Obviously drug culture and everything is very different in Japan, but it did.
Yeah, I find it fascinating because drug stuff never comes up in anime.
Yeah.
Like, it's so rare. Obviously, not to say that it doesn't come up in other media in Japan, but specifically in like more kind of prominent stuff like anime, live action, like even in like the Yakuza series, which would be, in terms of video games, which would be a very prime franchise to have lots of stuff about drugs because it's all about like organized crime and everything. It's super rare for it to come up. It almost never comes up at all. And even when you have like, say, like Judgment/Judge Eyes, where drug stuff does come up, it's like pharmaceutical drugs, not like illegal street drugs. And so it's like, I'm kind of with you that there's something, particularly when the marijuana comes in, it's a little bit silly. Like, I think when it's LSD, that's like exotic enough of a drug that I'm more fine with, like your weird magic LSD shit. When it's like, this is super marijuana, that's pretty goofy. But there is something I find fascinating about the fact that it's in it at all, because it's so rare. It's particularly compared to American media, where it's like trivially common for a drug use to be depicted or for it to be like an element of a story. There's something I'm like impressed that, you know, there's a scene in this movie where Kokutou is high on acid, where he took that acid tablet and he went back to Gakuta's place. And I think all of those scenes are actually quite well done. I think it's when the marijuana comes in that it feels silly from, as you say, like a modern American perspective. It's like, if it was just not marijuana, I don't think it would really raise an eyebrow at all.
No, and you know, I always, this is something I try to avoid, and I get a little, I raise an eyebrow when other people do it, of I'm not going to try to like judge anime by my cultural standards. And for those who don't know, the attitude towards like street drugs in Japan is very different than in America. You can go look that up if you want. It's just, you know, we have a bad approach to drugs in America, but it is more of like a third rail to even talk about in Japan, which is why you don't see it in anime much, as Sean was just saying. But yeah, I think it is there's a line where he says, yeah, this kind of marijuana isn't addictive, but it will do this. And I'm like, no marijuana is addictive. What are you talking about? Like, it's, you know, anyway, it doesn't bother me. I don't think it hurts the movie. It's just something where like, that's a place where I raised an eyebrow because it felt maybe, and again, acknowledging just like where I am in the world and time and all of that, a little silly. That said, you know, this was written in the 90s, and if you did this in the 90s in America, wouldn't feel out of place. So, you know, cultures aren't that different.
Yeah, it's like that and the like serial killer room with like the film strips and all of that, like so remind you that's like, oh, right, this was written in like 1997,
Yes.
1998, because it's very like Seven and stuff like that was like very popular around that time. Because, you know, Seven, I think it was like 95 or 96. And there's other serial killer stuff around there that like, I think it's, you know, it's just like a part of that like movement of serial killer fiction around that time. And it's like weird because it ends up feeling almost like a period piece because it feels very 90s in some of those moments. But it only feels like a period piece because the movies were made much later. And it's just set in the same time period the original stories was set, which was contemporaneously. So yes, like that's another thing that I think the drug stuff is partially that. And then like some of the serial killer stuff feels so 90s to me, not in a bad way, just like in a, oh, right, yes, this was not just set in 1998, it was written around 1998.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing we need to talk about is the idea, I assume this is an idea in other Kinoko Nasu stuff, correct me if I'm wrong, but the origin, the like place people come from, and of course this is Touko gives us the exposition using Russian dolls, which is a nice little visual touch of the idea that there's a place like far enough back in creation that is like the origin of like, you know, the your existence. I almost like the way I was thinking of it was almost like the Carl Sagan star stuff. Like on some level, everyone is made of the same pieces of matter, and like we go that far back. For mages, it's what's called instincts. It's not something that'll control you overall. She describes it as like something you can like push against, but it is like this thing that could be activated, and that is the evil thing that Soren has done to Rio. Although Rio again does have agency in all of this. But this is kind of like the source from movie 5. This is a philosophical, metaphysical idea I really like and find like fascinating.
Yes, and it comes up in movie 5. We talked about it a little bit, and I tried to like explain it without remembering that, oh wait, I don't need to try to explain what the origin is at all because Touko does it really well with Russian nesting dolls and all that shit. Yes, it is one of like the core metaphysical things. It's not going to come up in a very obvious way, I think, in Fate. It's a big thing in stuff like Fate Grand Order, and like Mahotsukai no Yoru, I know, and Tsukihime both do it. But yes, it is this idea that like at whatever origin point back, like at the beginning, like, you know, before the reincarnation cycles and stuff like that, wherever your soul or the thing that becomes your soul was created, that is your origin, and it has certain attributes. And I think for most people, your origin is kind of whatever, right? And in movie 5, Soren says to Tomoe that his origin is worthlessness. We know that Shiki's origin is nothingness, but that's like nothingness, like in like mu in Japanese, or it's the kata of kata no Kyoukai. In the book, it's actually represented, because this is very stylistically fun, it's represented by an empty space. It's like brackets and then like empty space, and then it goes on. So it's like clever. Not even a word. It's literally like an empty nothingness on the page. And that's what Shiki's origin is. And that obviously connects to her eyes of death perception, her ability to be close or connected to the root in some way. And, you know, Rio is unfortunate in that his origin has a particularly unique bent to it, which is that it's devour. It's taberu. It's just like the word to eat is what Touko uses. And so she says, like, probably like in his previous life cycles earlier in, you know, the reincarnation stuff, that he probably was a predator, right? And this soul was recycled over and over again as they use like imagery, because she's watching like a nature documentary or something with like cheetahs eating gazelle and shit like that. And that eventually he was in, you know, eventually that soul became this person. And again, it would maybe manifest and he would be gluttonous or something. And there's like a lot of ways that might manifest in a minor way, but it wouldn't control your whole life. But Soren is able to sort of what she calls activate his origin and make it this like dominant factor where he is like a slave to it. And it both is a thing that makes him physically powerful and kind of imbues him with some like the unnatural, like weird strength he has and stuff like that we see in the series, because he's slowly like transforming into a monster more or less. Because I think Touko describes it as like he is able to access like the memories and abilities of every life that his soul has reincarnated through. That's part of the effect of his origin being activated, is he's like becoming kind of like a maxi being of all the things that his soul has been through in the cycle of reincarnation. And that is one of the reasons why he needs to be stopped, right? That it's like he's gone too far. He is gone too far in letting those impulses control what he's doing. And she describes it as basically being like, you should treat him as like a wild beast more than a person at this point because it's too late for him.
But it's a cool idea. I also like what she points out of that the spell to do this requires the consent of both the subject and the mage.
Yes.
So it is something that Ryo had to opt into, which we saw in the post-credit scene of movie 6, which is a fantastic scene. I almost wonder if that would have worked just as well as the pre-credit scene of movie 7, although I think that would have messed with I like that movie 7 does open with another scene in the apartment. But it is such a good post-credit scene in terms of the just fucking... It is gory and graphic, and Soren is such a... even from at this point, chronologically, he's dead, but of course, in the scene, it's earlier, but he is still haunting us in all these ways. That vocal performance is so good. It's freaky stuff, and it's another, like I said, metaphysical concept I like. I am definitely vibing with the metaphysics of the Kinoko Nasu verse. That's probably a good signal for the rest of this season of Japanimation Station.
Yes, that's fantastic because it means that when we get into some of the other stuff in Fate, we can talk about noble phantasms and heroic spirits and the Throne of Heroes, what true magic is, what the Heavens Feel is. There's so many great conversations ahead because I love this shit so much. It's one of the reasons why I like getting into the spin-offs and stuff because I just love the weird worldview and the weird fantasy setting and the unique trappings of Nasu's stuff because yes, all these kinds of ideas, they're in Tsukihime, they're in Mahotsukai no Yoru, they're in obviously Fate all over the place, so there's lots of this stuff ahead of us.
I didn't know the Heavens Feel was an actual concept. I thought it was just a cool title for those movies, but
it gets to be both.
Yay, I love it. All right, what else do we need to say about this film? The fucking music, oh my god.
Oh my god.
It's incredible. The final track of the movie, before we go into the credits, the music in the big reunion scene, for lack of a better term, where they are coming back together, is so amazing. When they are embracing at the end of the film, there's this big swell that is a play on the main theme of the series, the sort of Shiki theme that is usually given to us with this kind of freaky choir and is kind of ominous, but it becomes almost this big romance swell. Oh my god, that is... I was listening to the soundtrack before we were recording, and that track is incredible.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then it transitions into the song Seventh Heaven, which is the Calafina song, which is, of course, the song that takes the Shiki theme and uses it as the main motif for that lyrical song, which is very satisfying. I love that song because it's just it feels like Kata no Kyoukai distilled into a I don't know if you call it J-pop or whatever, but a pop song kind of thing.
It is also the name of the Calafina album that has all of these themes and some other stuff as well. It's their debut album, Seventh Heaven. It's the final track on that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really great. Yeah, all across this movie, the music is incredible because it gets to take a bunch of the individual themes. You get a very good version of the movie 2 theme, which is that great nostalgic, the school theme, and you get that in some of the flashbacks, and I think that's very powerful to have that theme come back because she hasn't used it since movie 2. And so that's one of the most striking themes in the movie, and so getting that to come back for this one is great. As you say, the culminating piece, which takes the very haunting kind of needing theme of Shiki, that feels like it's never quite complete, and she has some musical phrases that feel like it sort of brings that piece of music to a culmination that it's always been edging towards, but it's never been able to quite to grasp. I think it's one of the really ephemeral qualities to the music in Kata no Kyoukai is that main theme has never quite settled yet, and then it finally gets to musically settle in that moment as these two people embrace. This is my favorite of the soundtracks for any of the individual movies, mostly because it gets to just work with all of that musical material and bring it all to a big conclusion. It's fucking great.
It really is incredible that as good and big and epochal as the source material itself is, that this anime adaptation nailed every single piece of it. The animation, the direction, that they were able to do it in a structure where every chapter got its own movie, that they did it in the right order, that they got the just best voice actors possible for every single part, that Yuki Kajirua comes in and does one of the greatest achievements in anime scoring of all time. It's just, it is such a complete package of a work. There is no, like, confusion from me of, like, why is Kara no Kyoukai such a famous work among anime fans? Oh, it's because it does literally everything well. And not just well, but, like, you know, it feels like a generationally powerful work.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Thinking of voice actors, I do want to shout out, because here we get a voice actor, if you're a fan of Weekly Suit Gundam, we've talked about before, which is Soichiro Hoshi, who is the voice of Ryo Shirazumi Dio, the villain of this film, and he is Kira from Gundam Seed and Seed Destiny, or a more similar role would be his Akachi in Persona 5, the Royal. This is one of his, like, sort of, like, typecasting kind of roles, which is like the pretty boy who is secretly a fucking maniac. That's obviously not Kira in Gundam Seed. Depending on how you interpret Seed Destiny, he's not playing it that way, at least. But yes, this is a really good performance from him. I think he does just a good job of, like, particularly in those moments of, like, lucidity the character has in those conversations with Kokutou, where you can see that there was, like, a human underneath all this shit at one point, but you also can tell that he is too far gone. And then when you allow him to just sort of, like, totally, like, fucking go crazy, and he's just acting like a monster, which is what Ryo is at the end of the movie, effectively. I think he's, like, really powerful in those moments. It's like, that has to be, like, an unpleasant thing to have to do as an actor, is to, like, you know, having to play the scene where he's, like, basically trying to digest Shiki externally, right, when he's drooling on her, and it's like, it's such a disgusting, like, and you were talking about, like, kind of body horror thing where he's demeaning her so much by putting her as, like, she's just a thing in a body now, and it's where you feel, oh, this is what allows him to kill people, because he doesn't really see the person, he just sees, like, that lump of meat that he's going to, like, literally devour. And it's intentionally, like, supposed to be so, like, kind of dehumanizing for Shiki as she's sitting there wondering, why the fuck am I letting this happen? Like, why am I letting them do this to me? As she's, like, existing entirely in this kind of mental space, while he is just obsessed with what her body is. It's also where you get some of the gender stuff, right? Where he like, you know, he like licks her breasts, right? As he's, like, covering her in his drool. So it's, like, intentionally sexualized in this way to make her, him trying to embody her as, like, a woman, when we know that she's more complex than that. And that, like, that is not really what she is, that she is maybe agender or non-binary or however you want to think of it. Like, it is him putting her into that body or trying to do that, and he fails to do it. But, like, that is, like, such a unpleasant thing, I think, for an actor to try to play, and he is, like, uniquely good at doing that stuff and, like, really kind of, like, going into it full bodily. I think, like, understanding the importance of, like, the intensity of that kind of scene. I mean, he's, like, one of those actors that I think can really nail what you need to do to make that scene play.
It's a fantastic performance, and I also want to say I think it's entirely possible that between Gundam Seed and Gundam Seed Destiny, Kira was visited by Soren, and he activated Kira's origin, and Kira's origin was to be an insufferable little narc, and that is what he became in Gundam Seed Destiny.
I really want to hear Nakata Joji, the voice actor that plays Soren, say it's like, and your origin is to be a narc.
Yes. I don't know what, like, how you would, like, do that in the actual, like, metaphysics of this, like, what at the, like, source of creation is the impulse towards being an insufferable little narc, but that is where Kira Yamato, circa Gundam Seed Destiny, at least came from. So there you go. But no, great performance, and great performance all around. I think, I forget the name of the actor who plays Kokutou, but this is I think the best work he does in the whole series is in this one. It's incredible. Yeah,
Suzumura Kenichi, husband to Sakamoto Maya.
Yes, exactly.
I just have to repeat that as much as I can, because it's still, like, keep that in mind. Sometime after the point of these movies, those two people got married in real life.
That chemistry, you can't fake that chemistry that they have in these, you know? God, and Maya Sakamoto, just towering work. I don't even know how you describe what she's doing in these 7 movies, because it is... The fact that she, in a relatively short span of time, played Aigis in Persona 3 and then did this is like... Jesus Christ, that puts you on the Mount Rushmore. Holy crap, it's great.
I did between the last episode and this one, I did find an interview that does confirm that that at least Kinoko Natsu and Takashi Takeuchi had specifically played Persona 3 before these movies were made and knew her from that game. I mean, they knew her because she also was, like, famous for music stuff. And that's like what she was most well known for. But I found an interview where they fucking say, I guess, from Persona 3 when talking about Sakamoto. And Sakamoto Maya was in the interview also. And I was very satisfied. I was like, oh, yes. Like some of the stuff we're feeling, that is part of what happened here.
Well, it makes sense because if you've only played Persona 3 in English, the English performance is fantastic. Nothing bad to say about it. It's great. But the English voice actress goes for a more sort of robot who becomes less robotic over time, where she has like kind of a robotic inflection to her voice early on, right? And they even do a little filter on it. And Maya Sakamoto doesn't quite do that. It's more in like speaking style, it's more subtle stuff, and it is, I would say, an overall like kind of subtler journey she puts Aigus on over the course of that. And I think that makes a lot of sense for what you need to do then with Shiki in this. I think I can see the A to B there very clearly.
Yes. And she's incredible in these movies. And this movie in particular like asks her to go through a lot because it's like Shiki having to, like symbolically die, right? She needs to become a different person than she is in the same way that Mikia does, right? Like at the end of this movie, they both symbolically die in order to become someone closer to what the other person needs so that they can actually be together. Mikia needs to get off his high horse and sort of embrace that all this is more complex. He needs to like recognize that, that like people are going to make mistakes and that those mistakes might be like killing this dude, and that's okay. That doesn't have to be the end of things. And so he's able to sort of, he has to become more flawed and more kind of broken. And then Shiki has to, like choose to be a human, right? She has to choose to go for that. And a really important moment is that she pulls back and that she only kills Rio at the very end because it's like the last option and she thinks that Kokutou is dead. But like she also values her relationship with Kokutou so much that when she is about to deal the finishing blow originally, she has that flash of Kokutou, and that's what stops her because she realizes if she just sort of goes in there guns blazing and just like willfully just fucking murders this dude on the spot, she's killing part of what her relationship with Kokutou is. And that it's like her just walking up to his house and going in and just killing this guy is not the way it needs to go. And so it's like having to sort of play both these parts of these people finally kind of breaking down, symbolically being resurrected and coming together in the end so that they can be the like one whole, right? If you want to read the yin yang pieces and all that kind of stuff in there as well, like that's I think part of what's happening here. And it's I think a thing that asks a lot from an actor to get all the nuances of those kind of transformations while retaining the core of the character the whole time. And I think both actors do that beautifully.
Absolutely. One scene we haven't really talked about is I guess epilogue is the wrong word because there is a specific epilogue OVA that we're going to talk about next week. But the post-credits scene here, which like the ending of the movie going into the credits is so perfect that I didn't need any more, but it's a beautiful scene that we get at the end here. And on that theme of like death and rebirth, it's specifically framed there outside and the sakura have blossomed. The cherry blossoms are out. And of course, sakura in the Japanese context, they symbolize transience. They symbolize death and rebirth because they bloom and they're beautiful and alive and vibrant for a short period of time. Then they go away. And, it's a very common metaphor that you'll get in lots and lots and lots of Japanese media. But I think it's very pointed here because it's maybe the most colorful scene in the entire freaking movie series. And then I love the dialogue they have. There's a line Kokutou has here where it's translated as, "I've taken the liberty of being in love with you for many years." I love that line. That's like one of my favorite like little romance lines now that I think I've ever seen. But he's saying, "So even now I've decided to selfishly take care of you even if you don't like it." And then Shiki admitting like, "Look, there's things the old Shiki didn't like, but the current Shiki doesn't dislike those things." And accepting his hand the same way she did a knife and all that. And like, man, if this were any less good a series, this might be too treacly an ending. But in this series, it's just fucking perfect.
Yeah, I did because I was looking up in the book, I was curious, like, specifically I was looking at the book for the epilogue stuff we'll talk about in the next episode because I was curious how that showed up. But I did read the very ending of the book, and like everything here is like word for word exactly the very, very ending of the book. Like all the dialogue is exact, which I just thought was interesting. Like this is one of the closest of the things that I read from the book. This is like one of the closest adaptations of a scene I think I've seen from them, which is interesting. Because, yeah, there is something like a lot of Kara no Kyoukai has this very ephemeral quality, and this scene is also very ephemeral, but in such a different way, right? It is like, it's ephemeral in this like happy way of them going off to some sort of like future together, right? And you have the beautiful imagery of the sakura trees. It's obviously it's spring, which is I think the first time in the series it has ever been the spring, right? We've been like the winter when they first met. We've been in like the summer of them in school together, and then the summer of like all the first couple of movies. Then we were in the fall with like movie 5 and 6. And then movie 7 is at like the very beginning of December. And so this is like the following spring. It is rebirth. It is them together. And there is something so kind of like quaint about Shiki's line about what I always wanted wasn't a knife. It was just like your hand, or like the palm of your hand in mine, I think is what she says in Japanese there. And that's like, it's as you say, any other series, this would maybe be too schmaltzy. But because you've seen how much work has gone in for these two people to have to kind of like, these two broken people that had to be totally broken down and rebuilt up together, that there's something so appropriate about this. I love the rest of the scene is also like, she says that, oh, I need to go to school tomorrow. We learned that she's going back to school because obviously she missed her last couple of years of high school because she was in that coma. And then Mikia says, oh, you can just ditch that, and it's like, why don't you come out, hang out with me? And it's the two characters right in the opposite position. Usually Mikia's like the like boringly responsible one. Shiki's the one that's like, why are you being such a square, man? Like, let's go hang out, or let's go do this. And they're both kind of pushing into the other person's territory. It's a very satisfying little exchange right at the end to give you that sense of how these two people have changed through these experiences.
And the joke about Shiki never visiting him in the hospital because Azaka threatened her, which is hilarious because, of course, Azaka couldn't really threaten Shiki, but I like that Shiki played along with it anyway.
Yes.
It's good for a laugh. But no, it makes sense to me that this is very close to the book because it literally ends with a literary address. It's a narration from her in the first person saying, no matter what happens, I don't think I'll ever let go of this hand. So this is the end of my story. I'll live my life as I accept my current self and Shiki from my past. I'm imagining that's just the final lines of the book, probably, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
it's this, and then it goes into the epilogue.
Yeah. But yeah, for the original project, the 7 chapters and the 7 movies, this is pretty damn near perfect, Sean. This is pretty good.
Yeah, these movies are fucking great. I obviously knew that going in, but clearly these are movies that are even better on rewatch. Like, it's obvious the first time you watch them that you're like, these are movies that are going to be, it's like Shark's Counterattack. It's going to be even better on a rewatch. It has been tremendously satisfying to get to watch these movies again and do podcasts on them. Of course, we're not totally done, but we are done with the original story, as it were.
It's fantastic, and obviously we will give more wrap-up thoughts next time when we do the final pieces, but yeah, Kara no Kyoukai had been hyped to high heaven for me. It has a certain reputation, and it exceeds that reputation. It is that kind of work. It is that kind of monumental achievement, and I'm so glad we got to talk about it, do podcasts on it. Really good one to cross off the bucket list because it does not get much better than this.
Yes, I mean, there was a good reason why I was like, I don't think you would ever been resistant to it, but I was personally, when I knew we were going to do one of this topic, I was like, we have to do Kara no Kyoukai. I was like, personally, like super adamant. Again, I don't think you would have ever been like, why would we do that? We should just go straight to Fate. But it was just like, we are definitely doing Kara no Kyoukai because it would be criminal to just skip over this to go straight to Fate, even though that is obviously the more kind of widely known, more popular one. Even though, Kara no Kyoukai is very beloved, it's just Fate is the thing that spawned this huge mega franchise. This is its own little story, that's like, other than a couple of crossover events and little tiny things here or there, like Kara no Kyoukai is just Kara no Kyoukai. Like, these characters don't typically pop up in other stuff. Every once in a while you'll get, the collaboration event in FGO, and Shiki's in that, and Fujino's in that. There's like, maybe they'll get a little cameo in a manga spin-off of something else because they're like out there in the world. But Kara no Kyoukai is kind of like a special little thing that they've never done a huge amount with, and I think that that's intentional. That it is meant to be it is this story, and it's done, and like these characters get to kind of have their happily ever after. And then we have our giant franchise moneymaker with Fate, and that gets to be the thing that will do an infinite number of spin-offs because that series is made for it.
Yeah. But this is a great start. It makes me very, very excited to engage with the rest of the Nasuverse. And, of course, the Fate shows are the immediate thing we're doing here on Japanimation Station. But, yeah, this is my shit. This is very much my shit.
Yes, it is obviously also my shit and has been for a while. I'm glad that you're on this journey with me wholeheartedly. So next time on the show, again, we are not totally off the Kata no Kyoukai train because we've got a couple of things to finish up. So we will be covering 3 things on the next episode. And these are the order that they were made in, and it is also, they're all on Crunchyroll. So if you're just watching on Crunchyroll, they have them in the right order there as well. It's the epilogue, which is a 30-minute thing that is from the novel as well. So it takes place after the end of this movie. Then you have movie 8, which is based on an additional chapter that Nasu wrote in, I think, 2008. So it's after these movies started production. That's called the Kata no Kyoukai Future Gospel. And then there was an extra kind of OVA made as a part of that process based on a series of manga by Takashi Takeuchi that's like some short side stories called Future Gospel Extra Chorus. Again, that's also about 30 minutes. So we've got epilogue, Future Gospel, Extra Chorus. All those are on Crunchyroll, very easily accessible. And that is going to wrap up our adventure in the world of the Garden of Sinners.
Japanimation Station. ションステ